Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching.
Little girls are notoriously fond of playing dolls. Emily was no exception, but with one correction: in her games, dolls were decorative. Simply put, Emily liked to play cook, and the dolls were the children or guests she fed. As the girl grew older, the dolls became the audience for a cooking show. Hosted, of course, by Emily. She would turn to them and tell them how to make some interesting dish. Often it existed solely in her imagination. So what? Mom thought with a smile. And suddenly the moment will come, and the dish will become very even real author. The first culinary achievement of 8-year-old Emily was scrambled eggs, then fried potatoes, and then salads, soups, chicken legs, a lot of things. And it was all really good. Emily loved to cook and put her heart into every dish. Her mom was a great cook. Once Sarah even won a city competition. Talented cook, in addition to a solid monetary reward, received a place as a leading chef in one of the best restaurants in the city. Emily was proud of her mother, and in the 5th grade decided to follow in her footsteps. After school, she entered the Institute of Food Industry. Her parents were proud of her. But unfortunately, Sarah was not destined to rejoice at the red diploma of her daughter. When Emily graduated from the 3rd year, her mother became seriously ill. The diagnosis sounded like a verdict. However, Emily and her father to the last hoped for a miracle, but alas. Having buried his beloved wife, John withdrew into himself, and after the 41st day, the luckless widower decided to move to the suburbs, to a half-abandoned village with the cheerful name of Ruberville. Why would you do that? Puzzled his daughter. You get so lonely in the middle of nowhere. And her father knew that solitude would do him good. The fresh air and nature should help him recover from his loss and put his thoughts in order. It's not so remote, father objected. It's not far from the city. And yet the nature is fantastic. So he went to Ruberville and became a hermit. There's no other way to put it. The house he lived in was on the edge of the village, apart from everyone else. It was said to be the home of a sorcerer who had mysteriously disappeared after his death. Emily loved her father very much, and after her mother left, they became even closer. The daughter often visited John and herself loved country life. Awaking for the first time to the sound of the rooster, Emily was surprised at how well she'd slept and felt truly rested. What's there to be surprised about? Her father hummed with a smile. In the city, the cars come and go day and night. Here it's quiet, peaceful. Ruberville was nice no matter the season. The snow was blindingly white in winter, and it smelled fresh, and the air seemed to smell like watermelon. In spring, when everything came to life and blossomed, it awakened the most positive, and in some people even romantic thoughts. Some are pleased with bright colors, and to swim in the cleanest lake was an incomparable pleasure. Autumn pampered vacationers with plump apples, forest mushrooms, and the results of hard gardening work. In short, each season had its own charms. In one more wonderful moment, everyone in the village was ready to help each other and respected each other. By the way, after a couple months of living in Ruberville, John gave up his reclusive lifestyle. He made many friends among the locals and enjoyed going fishing with the men. And on occasion, he was invited to family reunions. Emily also suspected that her father was seeing someone, but John never talked about it, and Emily understood why. Apparently he's uncomfortable in front of me, Emily thought. Probably thinks he's betraying his mom's memory that way. Silly. I wish him happiness. Emily herself, a year after graduation, got a job as a cook in the school cafeteria, and a little later married the school's sponsor, businessman Michael Green. He was the owner of a cab ordering service, a car service, and an adjacent car wash. After the wedding, the young couple moved into a house Michael had recently purchased, and one day a boy of about 6 years old knocked on the door of the house. Judging by his poor, not very clean clothes and long uncut hair, he was a street kid. "What do you want?" Michael Green asked gruffly. Until Emily had children of her own, and if it was a sore subject for her, her husband took it calmly. Michael was fine with it. In fact, he once said, "What's the hurry? Whether the baby comes sooner or later is not that important to me personally." Emily hoped that this approach on her husband's part would change, but there was nothing she could do. Her mother-in-law, on the other hand, was on her son's side. "Well, really," said Nina Pavlovna, "what's the hurry with children? First you need to get on your feet, and then already think about offspring." Emily was puzzled. People count pennies, and they manage. But here we have a fancy house, a nice car money. And we, it turns out, need to get on our feet. However, she did not dare to voice these thoughts aloud. When she first mentioned children, Nina Pavlovna said that she had outdated views on life. The boy looked at Michael with wide-open eyes, and it seemed that he was about to cry. "What do you want?" repeated the master. "Uncle, I need some money," the boy spoke timidly. "Mommy is very sick. She needs money for treatment, and we have no more." "What's that got to do with me?" In the child's hands was a photograph, a glance at which Michael immediately recoiled. "I don't have a dime," he cut off and unceremoniously slammed the door shut. Emily was working in the garden at this time. She was lovingly tending to the flowers she cherished and nurtured. Though she didn't see the scene on the doorstep, but she did see the boy, who was sluggishly wandering toward the wicket with tears in his eyes. She quickly wiped her hands and hurried to him. "Baby, what's wrong?" Emily asked, approaching the unhappy child. "Mommy is very sick," he exclaimed. "She needs surgery and we don't have any money. And Stepa drinks all the time and he doesn't care. And I want to help my mom. I thought my uncle would help, but the boy sobbed again.
"What's your name?" Emily asked affectionately.
"Kostya," the child sniffled. "And I'm Aunt Emily," she introduced herself and asked, "Kostya, what made you think this uncle would help you?" "Well, it's just that my mom has his picture," Kostya explained. Emily suddenly felt uneasy. Kostya's mom had Michael's picture, and that's why Michael was supposed to help this boy with his bereavement. If it weren't for her pity for the boy, Emily would find the whole story absurd. When she mentally figured out the age of the little guest, she assumed that Michael had probably had an affair with this woman before the wedding, and the result of that was standing in front of her. But why had Michael refused to help? Emily was perplexed, so she decided to do it herself, in secret from her husband. "Tell you what, Kostya," Emily said firmly. "Let's do it this way. You tell me your address, and I'll bring the money tomorrow. How much do you need?" The boy named a sum of money, not a small amount, but to help a poor boy, a sacred thing. Emily had always been sure that it was the right thing to do, unless, of course, they were done out of the goodness of their hearts. "Okay, I'll help you," she nodded with a kind smile. "You'll really give money?" Kostya asked, looking at her incredulously and somehow maturely. Emily felt sad, so small, and already he doubted someone's sincerity. "Well, of course," she assured him, and the boy, having said the address, left. She, sighing heavily, headed in the direction of the house. Michael was sitting on the porch. Emily guessed from the grim expression on his face that her husband had seen the whole thing and was talking to the Sank about something. "So?" he asked, and his voice didn't bode well. Emily was embarrassed. She didn't know what to say. She hated to lie, but there was no other way. She decided to tell the truth. She was going to give the boy all her savings, which she had saved up for a fancy birthday present for her husband. But Michael didn't need to know that. His birthday was still a month and a half away, and money would come in handy. Emily was visibly relieved when she made her decision, but she still wanted clarity. "Michael," she addressed him over dinner. "Yeah," he responded concentrically, cutting a piece off a chicken thigh. "Have you had many girlfriends before me?" Why the sudden interest? Wondered the husband. "Well, it just got interesting." "Interesting, then," he repeated. "There are some things that are not told even to one's favorite wife. To a wife, though, that's special." "Come on," smiled Emily. "That was before my time." Her spouse's face was suddenly wary, and she realized that Michael had figured out her intentions. More importantly, he clearly didn't want to talk about it. Honestly, I don't have time to talk," he said in a disgruntled voice, confirming her assumption. "When I've got a big project coming up and you're pestering me with nonsense. That's it, I'm full. Thanks for dinner." The conversation didn't work out that way. "And another thing," he added, getting up from the table. "What if that boy shows up on my doorstep again? Chase him down, or I'll do it myself." "Somehow this is all strange," Emily pondered. "Photographs are understandable. But a last name and a first name are enough in such cases. But what if there was no marital connection to this boy's mother? Or maybe it was something else. The next day, leaving work, she went to Tom's house. The address was uninspiring, to say the least. The boy's family lived in the most remote private sector. There was a single, run-down convenience store near which all sorts of rabble hung out around the clock. That was the infrastructure. Tom was at home with his drunken stepfather, who, upon seeing the young, beautiful guest, perked up. "Wow, what a chick came," exclaimed Jack. "What?" he asked embarrassedly. "Jack, I say, my name is," he smiled broadly, showing his rotten teeth. "What's your name?" "Emily," she replied demurely. She had no desire to meet this Neanderthal, but etiquette was etiquette. If she was here on business, it wouldn't hurt to introduce herself. Emily, with a cool walk. "Emily, have you got a hangover?" Emily had been able to stand up for herself since she was a little girl, so it wasn't hard to fight back against this drunken clown. "First of all, I'm not Emily, and I'm not on a first-name basis. We haven't crossed paths," she said coldly. "And secondly, I'm not your alcohol delivery service." "Oh, I didn't please her," Jack smirked. "Big deal, what a chick." Emily had no desire to listen to drunken ramblings, so she motioned for Tom to go to his room. "Let's go," replied the boy readily. So once there, Emily immediately saw the picture hanging on the wall. It was Michael looking at her, only slightly younger. "Tom, where did your mom get that picture?" asked Emily. "I don't know," the boy shook his head. "She never told me who the man was." "Didn't she say it was your dad?" "No," answered Tom. "Either the mother is hiding from her son that Michael is his father, or she isn't." Emily tried to draw conclusions. "I see," she nodded, taking an envelope of money out of her purse. "Is your mom in the hospital right now?" "Yes, but she's not having surgery. Aunt Mary said Mom is being supported by Medi. "You mean medically?" prompted Emily. "Yes," nodded Tom. Emily wondered, who was this Aunt Mary? There was nothing stopping her from asking, though. "And that's our neighbor," the boy explained. "She works at the hospital as an orderly. Aunt Mary is nice, brings me food, and when Uncle Jack gets violent, she lets me sleep over." "I see," Emily sighed. "Tom, I brought you some sausage, bread, some fruit and juice. Now, I've got to get to work." "Thanks," the boy replied with dignity, like an adult, and smiled like a child already. "I love it. It's only rarely eat sausage and fruit. I don't have any money." "I'll be sure to bring you more," the guest promised and left the room. Jack was already clearly drunk. He immediately started to reach for Emily's hands, long, unwashed, and dirty under his fingernails. But she firmly suppressed his advances. "Not at all. I'll call the police if you take liberties with me. And don't you dare hurt Tom." "Oh, come on," surrendered the drunk, who had already realized he was facing a serious lady who didn't throw words to the wind. On the way to work, Emily was deep in thought. That her husband was involved with Tom's mother was obvious. The question was different. Michael was obviously hiding something, but something told her, no, it wasn't about an intimate relationship with all the consequences. But what was it? She was going to have to find out. Emily was going to find out. Back at work, she went straight to her duties. "Hey, Emily, where have you been?" Julia, a co-worker and dear friend, asked. "Oh, just stopping by on business," she replied evasively. "You certainly look." "Wow, Julia, this is happening," Emily said with a sigh, and told her friend all about yesterday's visit and today's meeting at his house. "Don't you think you're just being scammed for money?" Julia asked. "It does seem a bit odd." "But that's how the boy asked Michael for money," Emily observed. "That's true," agreed her friend. "And actually that woman might have been counting on you being interested in the photo. Except what's it for? It's a mystery." "That's true. But I want to figure it all out," Emily declared. But neither she nor Julia had any idea that their conversation had been overheard by the head of the kitchen. The most annoying thing was not so much the fact of eavesdropping, as Olga's friendly relationship with Ashley and her unquenchable thirst to be the source of some interesting information. Ashley eventually learned that her daughter-in-law had started digging into her son's past. To say it was unpleasant was to say nothing. Ashley without delay, gave Emily a fun life. That same evening, she paid a visit to the young ones. "What are you, Emily? Oversalted the soup?" said the mother-in-law. "Have you fallen in love or something?" And Emily munched on a spoonful and shrugged. "I think it's fine," she replied. "Michael, I think the soup is oversalted. What do you say?" "He'll say we should be more careful," the older woman said without waiting for an answer. "You should be doing business, not sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." And then, as they call it, she was carried away. The mother-in-law shouted that Emily was not good enough to manage the household, and of course not good enough to take care of her son. Ashley's accusations lacked any logic, and her daughter-in-law wondered what had gotten into her. But if she'd known that the older woman in the kitchen had heard her conversation, she'd have no trouble understanding. Her mother-in-law's main goal was to make Emily as uncomfortable as possible, to keep her daughter-in-law, as she put it, from sticking her nose where it didn't belong. "That's right. Listen to what your elders tell you," Michael joined in his mother's criticism. "What did I do wrong?" Emily couldn't take it anymore. Working, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden. What else is required of me? What else is required of you? "I already told you at dinner last night," her husband replied with metal in his voice. "You are also required to respect your husband and not cross your elders. As long as you are in my house, you must obey me." "And I thought this was our home," Emily said bitterly, and ran out from the table. "What a lunatic." Ashley commented on her sister-in-law's behavior. Michael only sighed heavily. Emily hated being at home. She decided to get some fresh air and clear her head. The latter wasn't working out so well, but the September air seemed fantastic. She went wherever she was going and didn't notice how she ended up in the city park. It was dangerous, especially in the twilight that was inexorably thickening over the city. But at this moment, more than anything, she wanted to be alone. In a city that was buzzing with life, in the evening, that was simply not possible. Emily walked on, absorbed in her own thoughts, and didn't even immediately notice the hooligans approaching. "What a pretty little thing," said the big brute with the scar across his cheek, rubbing his hands together contentedly. "That's right," agreed the lanky, thin as a pole fellow. "What's that in our purse?" asked a third, short, shaven-headed stout man. "What do you want?" Emily thought in fear. "They want to rob me. Oh, mommies. What if they rob me?" I was lucky enough to wander into this park, which is like a home to these people. But there was no time to think. After all, and indeed threatened a serious danger. Two hooligans surrounded the young woman, with the express intention of devouring the contents of the purse, and at the same time its owner. "I'll scream," Emily said, trying to sound brave. "Scream, scream," replied the lanky man with a grin. The others laughed nastily, and without wasting a second, began the search. Emily tried to fight back, but alas, the forces were too unequal. "Hey guys," suddenly heard a voice from the bushes. From surprise, the bullies froze. Emily tried to run away, but the rascals, seeing that her protector was an ordinary vagrant, caught up with the victim and continued their mockery. "What do you want?" replied the short, stout man. "Go where you're going, or where you've been sleeping." The tramp was not noted for his physical strength, but to leave the girl in distress seemed to him unacceptable. He bravely grabbed her arm, made an attempt to get her out of the encirclement, but received a powerful blow to the bridge of her nose. Sparks seemed to fly from his eyes. Emily, wasting no time, kicked one of the intruders in the groin. The bastard howled, and the homeless man who had recovered from the blow kicked the lanky man. A scuffle ensued, as a result of which Emily and the homeless man managed to fend off the hooligans. "How are you guys doing? All right?" she asked her unexpected rescuer, wiping the blood from his nose with a clean handkerchief. "Intolerable," the man replied discreetly. "What brings you here? People are wary of walking here even in the daytime." "It just so happens," Emily replied evasively, and they headed for the park exit. "Wait for me here," Emily said when they were outside the supermarket. She bought a 1.5-liter bottle of still water to wash the blood off the hobo's face. "He's really quite nice," Emily thought with surprise. On the other hand, if a man was a vagrant, couldn't he be pretty? That evening, Emily and the vagrant, whose name was Alex, chatted on a bench near the supermarket until almost nightfall. The new acquaintance told her his simple story. From infancy, Alex was raised in an orphanage. But when he turned 15, he and a few other boys ran away from there. Why? She asked, perplexed. But away from the lawlessness that was going on there, the man replied, "It's now the pupils of orphanages live like in a resort. When I lived there, it wasn't easy." The handsome homeless man told stories about his life, and she felt like she was reading an adventure novel. The guy, who'd obviously had his fill, was a very interesting conversationalist and seemed like a pretty smart guy. And the fact that he was ready to come to the rescue characterized him as a good man and a real man. In another way, Alex could have achieved a higher position in society, Emily thought. I wonder how old he is. Taking a closer look at the guy, Emily decided he was about 27. Well, I mean, they were close in age, and she wondered why Alex hadn't done anything to change his fate. The answer came by itself. This guy, like many of his kind, didn't know any other life. He was used to going with the flow. Alex needed a guiding hand, and love, Emily thought, and for some reason she was embarrassed. No, a relationship between them was out of the question. She was married, and she barely knew him. And yet, Alex had a deeper crush on her than she'd realized. "You know, it's getting late," she said, and couldn't help but yawn. "Well, yeah," the guy agreed. "I'll walk you out or someone else will attack." Alex walked home, or rather to the dugout, where he lived with a couple of other similarly poor people, and thought, "Pretty girl. But she's no good to us. What house does she live in? And I ain't, in a word, a tramp." The boy sighed heavily and headed for the dugout. Emily, returning home, was disappointed to find her mother-in-law present. Actually, Ashley had stayed over before, if not for a week. But this time her presence was unfortunate. She wanted to talk to her husband face to face and find out what she was doing wrong. She showed up, not dusty. Her mother-in-law splashed her hands. "And where did you go?" "In the middle of the night." "None of your business," Emily replied mentally. But of course she chose to remain silent. "What, were you trying to draw attention to yourself?" Ashley persisted, but her sister-in-law ignored it. She was sleepy, and nothing else mattered. Things weren't always smooth sailing in a couple's life. It's normal to have that kind of life. Emily walked into the bedroom and sank powerlessly onto the bed. What the hell is this news? She thought. The marital bed was empty. The car keys, which were always on the table, were missing. The husband must have gone somewhere. At that moment, Emily clearly realized that her family life had cracked. And it all started with Tom's appearance in the photograph. But how can you not be ashamed? She reproached herself. It turns out that everything is the fault of the poor child. No, Emily answered herself immediately. It just has to be dealt with. And with that thought, she fell soundly asleep. And when she heard the alarm clock and realized with great regret that it was morning, Emily got out of bed. At work, she was in for a surprise, not a pleasant one. As Emily crossed the threshold of the school cafeteria kitchen, Amanda Green, the kitchen supervisor, rose up in front of her as if from the ground. "You have a lot of work to do today. You know there's an inspection coming up from the health and safety officials, so don't relax. Today it is necessary too," and she began listing what needed to be done. Emily's eyes widened. She couldn't do this in a week. Actually, the cleaning lady was supposed to do some of the work Emily had been assigned. But she had a different assignment, Amanda explained. "So we have to get it done," the older woman said admonishingly, and pleased with herself, left the kitchen. Ashley's request to bog her sister-in-law down with work had been successfully fulfilled. Emily was exhausted but ready to burst into tears. She had to do it. No one would do the work for her. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," she answered. "Hello, Sanitary and Epidemiological Department." A tall man in an expensive suit introduced himself. Beside him were two women, who immediately began snooping around the room. "Why is it so dirty?" One of the female employees of the Sanitary Epidemiological Station wrinkled her nose. "Where's the food labeling?" "That's what I was just about to do," Emily began to explain. "It's just that you decided it wasn't that important," another employee interrupted her. "And the dirt is just a small thing, an everyday thing." "It's not," Emily objected. "Where's the superintendent?" the woman asked sternly, discovering the dirt and lack of labeling. "Out," Emily replied. "So call her in. This is outrageous." She dialed Amanda's number, and she arrived 5 minutes later. The C's staff voiced their complaints, and the kitchen superintendent replied subserviently, "I've listened to you carefully and understood everything. The culprit will be punished." The representatives left, and Amanda began to scold Emily. "What do you think you're doing?" The kitchen supervisor lashed out at the cook. "What are you talking about?" Emily asked, perplexed. "About," Amanda growled. "As the person in charge, I instructed her to prepare properly. You tuned yourself to be no good. What you instructed me to do is enough for a week," exclaimed the cook. "What are you saying?" The supervisor splashed her hands. "You've got to work faster. And if you can't, look for another job. You're fired." "What?" Emily was taken aback. "What you heard. Go to accounting for your paycheck." Amanda. But after all, Emily really did have a lot of work to do. Julia tried to intercede on her friend's behalf. Besides, that group arrived almost at the very beginning of the cleanup. She physically couldn't have gotten everything done. And that's because you should be working on the job, not beating around the bush. The older one cut her off and delved into her notes, making it clear she didn't want to listen to anyone else. Emily tearfully left the kitchen and wandered toward the accounting department. It was very frustrating for her to be out of a job. It's never easy, but when you're fired so unfairly, it's doubly frustrating. But then again, good cooks are needed everywhere. Calmed down a bit, she thought, "We'll get through this. What if I get hired at some good place?" Emily cheered up. Emily went into the accounting office, got her paycheck, and, ignoring the sympathetic looks, went outside. The phone rang. "Tom." "Yes, hi," she answered affectionately. "Hello," greeted the boy to his patroness. "Are you all right?" Yes, she assured him. "Everything's fine. Did you want something?" "Jack nearly took away the money you gave me," replied Tom, and sobbed. "What a rascal," Emily exclaimed. "Well, I hope he didn't." "No, I had time to notice how he wanted to." "Wanted to take the envelope," began the boy's confused story, "and I didn't let him. He wanted to take it anyway, and I ran off with the money." "And where are you now?" Emily became worried. "At Aunt Mary's." "Well, good," Emily said with relief. "You don't go anywhere yet, and I'll go to the police. Do you understand me? Nowhere." "Understood," Tom said, "and the money's sure to be there." "Yeah, Uncle Jack didn't have time to take anything." "Great." This was the first time Emily had ever approached a police officer, so she didn't know where to start.
"Hello, who can I speak to about an adult trying to take money from a boy?" she asked the officer on duty.
"Your roommate?" the man clarified. No, Emily shook her head in annoyance. "That boy is a good acquaintance of mine, and his stepfather." Wait, the clerk grumbled. "Let's go in order. Who is this boy? And more importantly, where is his mother? Does she even exist?" "Well, yes," the young woman nodded and, pulling herself together, began to tell everything from the beginning. "So what?" The policeman sniggered after hearing her out. "What can we charge him with?" "So what is it?" she exclaimed excitedly. "I mean, he tried to take the boy's money, which is intended for the treatment of his roommate." "Have you any other evidence than the little boy's story?" the duty officer inquired ingratiatingly. "No." "And there's no judgment." "And how is that?" Emily marveled. "Well, like this." He spread his hands and looked somewhere over her head. "Did you want something?" Emily turned around and saw a very young boy behind her. "Yes, they told me to give you this," he replied, and held out some papers to the clerk. The man took them, thanked her, and looked at Emily as if she was nothing. "Lady, you're free to go," the clerk told her. "Woof, but you didn't take a statement from me, did you?" "That's right. I'm not going to do that," he replied nonchalantly. "Why?" "Because you are meddling in a matter that is none of your business. It's only their family's business, not yours. Besides, the stepfather didn't end up stealing anything. What do you want to charge him with?" "I see," Emily nodded. "And what a day," she thought sadly. "Got fired from my job. The police didn't take a statement. Hopefully that would be the end of it." "Wait," Emily heard. She turned around and saw the same guy who was handing the paperwork to the desk clerk. "What are you talking to me?" she asked.
You, the policeman confirmed with a smile. And what did you want?
"I heard by the edge of my ear and I think I can help you," the guy replied. "Really?" she asked skeptically. "You know, I understand your distrust, but I'm an intern, and for me right now, the more practice the better. Anyway, I can deal with this rascal." "You really want to help?" She decided to change her tone. There was no choice in the matter. What if this guy would actually be of use? "Yes, I do," the intern nodded. "Sorry I didn't introduce myself. My name's Chris." "And I'm Emily," she replied. "Nice to meet you," he smiled. "Text me the address of the abuser and I'll pay him a visit."
At least that'll be one less problem, Emily thought. But still, why the picture of Michael? Tom's mother, it turned out. It seemed the only way she could get an answer to that question was to go to the hospital and have a heart-to-heart talk.
Emily called Tom and he told her how to find his mom, so the young woman went to the clinic. Her name was Natasha, and at the sight of this woman, her heart clenched. Natasha's face was as pale as chalk. There were dark circles under her eyes. "Hello," Emily said quietly. "I'm the wife of the man your son came to ask for money. I gave Tom some, but I have one single question for you. What is your connection to Michael?" "You gave money to a stranger?" Natasha wondered. "Well, yes," the latter replied simply. "Michael turned him down, and I felt sorry for the poor boy. God didn't give me any children of my own, so I decided to do at least that kind of good deed." The patient sighed heavily and said, "Yes, I didn't think that such people still existed. I don't know how to thank you." "But who knows?" Emily smiled. "The earth is round, so maybe it'll still work out. When's the surgery?" "Right now, I'm hanging on to my meds, but if there's money available, I think within 2 or 3 days that issue will be resolved. Did you want to know what links me to your husband?" "Yes, I really want to know the truth, however unpleasant it may be." "All right then." Natasha and Michael met 8 years ago at a restaurant. Her car wouldn't start, and Natasha was trying to call a 24-hour towing service. To Michael, noticing the pretty brunette who had been unsuccessfully besieging that phone for the past half hour, approached her. "Can't you get through to the evacuation service?" "What's the use?" Natasha waved her hand. "It's usually a disaster on Saturday night." "So why is that?" Natasha inquired. "Who knows?" he shrugged. "Maybe there aren't enough people on the weekends. Or maybe everyone's cars break down like on demand." "And what's there to do?" "Nothing," the man smiled. "Leave your car in the parking lot and I'll drive you home." So the young men eventually exchanged phone numbers and agreed to meet the next day. Thus began their romance. Adam, Natasha's father, was seriously ill at the time, and as it turned out, that was the whole point. Michael knew that the successful businessman had a few months to live if things went well. And he also knew that Natasha was the only heiress, so he decided to hit on her. In the end, Michael, with the help of fake lawyers, wrote their will on him, deceived the young heiress. Natasha was left with nothing, but pregnant. She hoped to appeal to the conscience of the future father, but without success. "I do not need this child," Michael cut off. Of course he did, because he needed the business. The late Adam's assets had served as his initial investment in the business. "And I ended up with nothing," Natasha said sadly. Emily was shocked. She hadn't realized what a monster she'd been living with all this time. "And it just blows my mind," Emily said. "And you know, Natasha, I think mine is worth fighting for." "It's been so long," sighed the poor girl. "And I still don't believe that nothing can be done," Emily said firmly. "But all right, I won't bore you anymore. Rest goodbye." "Goodbye," Natasha said with a smile, suddenly feeling in this woman a kindred spirit. And Emily had once loved Michael with all her soul and had been cruelly deceived. And now, thanks to this apparently good, kind young woman, there was hope in Emily's soul. She smiled. What if meeting a woman with that name was a good sign? Michael came home disgruntled. It was not the mood he was expected to be in lately. "Did you get laid?" Emily grumbled. "Oh, you're one to talk," his spouse blurted out. "So where have you been in the middle of the night? I've been looking for you." From work, he replied with pathos. Yeah, of course, she muttered skeptically and, deciding not to postpone the unpleasant conversation, took the bull by the horns. And tell me, Michael, do you dream about Adam? There's a reason the boy was hoping you'd help him. Well, not for nothing. He was wrong to hope. I mean, a clean kid can't possibly think like his scumbag of a father. Digging it up, said the husband without a shadow of embarrassment. And you know I'm not going to justify myself to you. It's not for you to judge me. In business, the laws are wolfish. Every man for himself and survives as best he can. Personally, I've been accustomed since childhood to go straight. That's the way my mother raised me. Mother, Emily thought grudgingly. But of course without her. She suddenly realized that she didn't want to live with her husband, cheater, and even his mother lately, as if she had registered in their house, which, as Michael had assured at the beginning of Menga's married life, would be only theirs. That's fine, Emily exclaimed. You stay with your mother. I've had enough. Oh, she's still snapping Ashley, who was sitting next to her pretending to watch TV. Go ahead, roll. No thanks to you. Michael gave you a lifestyle you never dreamed of. And instead of gratitude, you're looking for something. It's pure slander. Emily had no desire to listen to her hated mother-in-law, so she ran upstairs to pack. Quickly throwing everything into her suitcase, she left forever the home she had once so lovingly organized. Only it turns out no one wanted it, she thought bitterly. All of her belongings didn't fit in her suitcase, so Emily decided to pack them later. Well, maybe I won't, she thought. I'm going to start a new life without these pompous people. New things will come in handy.
Emily walked to the bus stop and called Julia.
Hey friend, she said. Julia, I have a favor to ask of you. Can I come over to your place for a sleepover? Oh, did you have a fight with your husband or something?
Not a fight, Emily replied with a sigh. I left him.
So you know everything already, Julia said. Know what? Emily asked, perplexed. Yes, about your mother-in-law's shenanigans. What shenanigans? About your dismissal. What's the connection between my mother-in-law and being fired? Emily marveled. Ah, so you don't know everything, Julia realized. Well, come and tell me. I don't need to tell you over the phone. That's right, Emily agreed. All the more reason for the shuttle to pull up. Okay, wait. I'm waiting. Emily sat down in the vehicle and suddenly saw Alex, the same vagrant who had saved her from the hooligans, and he was crossing the road. For a second she thought of getting off the shuttle and catching up with him. But with a suitcase, it wasn't that easy. And the guy was already out of sight. Emily suddenly felt a regret she'd never felt before. She suddenly wanted to talk to him again. But it wasn't meant to be. Alex was rushing to the newly opened crisis center for victims of domestic violence and people in difficult life situations. Under other circumstances, he would have avoided the facility. But meeting Emily had turned his life upside down. Alex wanted to change his last name. He owed it to a neglectful mother who'd left her baby under a birch tree. And if not for the mushroom picker, the baby would have died of starvation and hypothermia. Lying under the birch tree, that's how the man told the staff of the orphanage. As a result, the poor nameless boy of a few days old was named after the mushroom picker. Alex Pinewood. He didn't know all this, but he had a hunch. After all, it was common practice to give names to children in the orphanage based on the circumstances under which they got there. I won't be Pinewood, Alex decided already at the crisis center. His old life was over. I'll be a productive member of society, not an invisible man with no one to lend a hand. And today, the now ex-tramp thought he saw his mother. Anna was getting on the bus, and while the guy was thinking whether to follow her or not, the bus had already started. Well, maybe it's for the best, he thought. Besides, I could have been wrong. I'll get on my feet and then I'll look for her. She's not happy with her husband. And also he would definitely go in for sports. And if to protect the lady of his heart, then the full program. Well, please come to the table, Julia said cordially. On the table appetizingly stood plates with borscht and towering bottle of the national drink. What's that for? Laughed Emily, pointing with her eyes to the vial of vodka. What's it for? Snorted her friend. I mean, you need to relieve stress. That's right, she sighed heavily. I got fired from my job. I left my husband. Tell me more about that. and Emily told of her quarrel with her husband and mother-in-law, her acquaintance with the tramp, her conversation with Natalia, and finally her leaving home.
Yes, my dear, shook Julia's head. I always thought you lived a dull life.
Well, that's exactly how it's been, shrugged Emily. It's been all adventure lately. Nor maybe it's for the best, her friend remarked. For the best. But I'd better find some inexpensive lodging right now. And when I get this job, we sold the apartment, as you know. Unless I move in with my dad. But he's got another woman. Wait, he lives in the suburbs. So what? So what if there's a house for rent there? Said Julia triumphantly. And Isabella is the aunt who rents the house, lives a floor above. I wonder how to find out, inquired Emily. But we can find out tomorrow morning. Isabella's working the hospital shift today. I see. Emily nodded and remembered. And what did you want to tell me about my dismissal? And you were fired at the instigation of your mother-in-law. Wow, how do you know that? Asked Emily in surprise. Well, our Olivia was never good at keeping secrets. I've heard her brag about it myself. Emily only waved her hand indifferently. You know, I don't really care anymore. When I left, I thought I'd start a new life. And why bring old problems into a new life? No reason encouraged her friend. And that's worth drinking to.
Well, I don't know, Isabella said. I was actually planning to rent the house to a married couple.
What difference does it make? Asked Julia. Yes, there is a difference, replied the neighbor. Your friend is getting a divorce, which means she'll be trying to get her personal life back together. How do you know that? Grinned Julia. I know. A woman who's used to a family is always looking for a new husband, and then she goes to his place. I'll have to look for new tenants again. Oh, I'm not going to look for anyone, interposed Emily. I have completely different plans for the near future. It's just that my dad lives in the suburbs, and with a man, it's up to me. That's right, said Isabella approvingly. I've never understood ladies who search dating sites. So they only go there for one purpose, to get a date. Who's your father? Mine's from out of town, too, Emily replied. John, Illinois. Is that the one who lives in the mansion? That's the one, Emily confirmed. I know, the neighbor nodded. A soulful man. What's there to do with you? Can you come down tomorrow and see the house?
Sure, exclaimed Emily, happy that the housing issue would be resolved.
Well, that's all right. If you like it, we'll talk about money. The house was small but very cozy. It was not far from my father's house. Which I like, Emily said. John, learning that his daughter would now live in the neighborhood, was happy. They'll visit each other now, he said in a satisfied voice. Finally, he introduced his daughter to Sarah, a pretty, funny, and very kind woman. I want Alex to move in with me, the father announced shyly. Dad, what are you doing? Laughed the daughter. You deserve happiness, and Mom will always remain in our hearts. But after all, we have a life to live on, so be happy and don't think about anything. Is that a blessing? Grinned the father. Well, consider it so. But I've got to get into town. How already? He chagrined. They hadn't seen each other in over a month. John missed him, and so did Emily. Michael wasn't much for country life, nor was he particularly friendly with his father-in-law, so her visits to her father became less and less frequent. Why did you forget I'm moving here? I'll be here tomorrow, and then we'll have a lot to talk about, Emily said cheerfully, and father and daughter walked to bus stop. So, see you tomorrow? She smiled. Yes, see you tomorrow, Emily. Back in town, she went to Natalia's house. How are you? Inquired Emily.
They've started prepping me for surgery, she replied. Natasha still looked weak and pale, but was generally holding up well. So it's all good. It's just that Tom's heart aches for me. Jack doesn't love him. I feel guilty all the time for getting involved with an idiot and an alcoholic too.
Natalia began to tell her that Jack had been a different person at first, but then he had gone off the rails. Natalia tried to break up with him, and the roommate said, "If you leave me, I'll kill myself." Well, I have no luck with men, Natasha sighed. I guess love isn't for me. Emily thought the same could essentially be said of her. But she didn't care for the discussion. Natalia, Don't worry about Tom, he's at your neighbor Mary's right now. Yes, I know, the woman nodded. Mary works here, keeps me informed. But she works around the clock, doesn't she? And I keep wondering if Tom's eaten, if he's sad alone. I'm afraid Jack might come over there when Mary's at work and start banging on the door. I understand, but I talked to a policeman I know the other day. He promised to calm your roommate down, deciding not to say she'd gone to the police specifically because of Jack's behavior. But why would a sick woman need unnecessary negativity? In fact, I'd like to offer Tom a place to stay, Emily continued. Wouldn't that be a burden on you? After all, Michael. No, Michael, Emily interrupted with a smile. Natasha, I left him. I moved to Rubil, rented a house there. What about your job? Asked Natalia, perplexed. Yes, unemployed now, Emily waved her hands with a smile. Mother-in-law did her best. It's a bit like her. I have a proposition for you. I'm listening to you carefully, Natalia smiled. Shouldn't we switch to you? With pleasure, the latter replied sincerely, after which she moved on to another question. While she was driving to the hospital, the idea of filing a lawsuit against Michael in court popped into her head. Of course, it would be good to find a savvy lawyer, but Emily was sure it wasn't that unrealistic. I think so too, nodded Natalia, who had already decided for herself. She would fight to the last, for Tom's sake and for her father's memory, especially since Natalia had always dreamed of going into business. So why did she give this opportunity to some worthless Michael, who could not think of anything more worthy than to rob a woman and her own son? The bastard had been living the high life for 6 years while she and her son barely made ends meet. So isn't it time to pay the bill? Emily left the hospital in high spirits, but she didn't realize that fate was preparing for another encounter. As she walked out of the gate, she was literally nose to nose with Alex. Wow, they exclaimed, rubbing their foreheads together and laughing. What brings you here? Emily asked. Got a job as an orderly, Alex answered importantly. Wow, good for you, she smiled. And where do you live? At the crisis center? Alex, how would you feel about me asking you to stay with me? Emily said in surprise and added embarrassedly, well, it's better than a crisis center. It's probably better. Why would it be? The boy wondered. I think a house like this has an army of servants. So you won't believe this, but there aren't any servants in that house, replied Emily, laughing. And only I don't live there now. I've rented a small but clean, cozy little house in the backwoods. Then I'm divorcing my husband. Can you help me around the house? Well, not as a servant, of course, but as a good friend. I just don't have enough men's hands sometimes. How does that sound? I don't know, Alex stretched out. Somehow it's all unexpected, and, after a little silence, waved his hand. It wasn't. I agree. Emily cheered. Yeah, the guy nodded. But just not today. I need to get off the registry at the crisis center, and the specialist won't be in until tomorrow. All right, tomorrow it is. After saying goodbye, she went to Mary, Natalia's neighbor, and picked up Kostya from there. The boy was delighted. John, too, was delighted with the little guest. Please come to the table, Papa said cheerfully. When did you have time to cook all this? Emily gasped in amazement as she looked at the table. There was nothing but salads, hot food, cuts of meat, and an impressive pie in the middle of the table. It's all serious, 'cause, Father said lovingly, looking at the woman. Well, and I helped a little. So what are we standing around for? Who are we waiting for? Indeed, why be modest? Sarah said cheerfully. Come on, have a seat. There's no truth in feet. There's a fish pie here, and I've got a sweet and creamy one too. So it's about to be finished. Great, said Tom admiringly. I love sweet. Well, that's wonderful. Eat it to your heart's content. We have all our own here, not store-bought, and the slices taste better than the store. Emily took a bite of the sandwich of homemade, fresh and fluffy bread with pulled pork, and squeezed her eyes shut and said, Wow, it's been a long time since I've had something this good. The rest of the dishes were also above reproach, as was the evening in a heartwarming and truly family atmosphere. Alex called the next morning and asked if the offer was still on the table. Of course it is, Emily said excitedly. I'm just on my way into town right now. The young people agreed to meet at a cafe near the bus station, and while Emily was on her way, she studied the internet to find a good lawyer. Alas, it was not so easy to find one. Reviews of citizens somehow did not impress, and some of them did not have them at all. I did not want to buy a cat in a bag. All the same services, and even in such a neglected situation, cost not cheap. So she decided to start calling them. She hoped that in the process of personal conversation can be determined it is worth the deal with this person or not. Yes, a good lawyer is worth his weight in gold right now, Natalia agreed. It's how they become lawyers. They take a course and think they are cool specialists. And that's why it's better to look for a good one through the Bar Association. Expensive, Emily saddened, but there's no choice. She didn't have much money left, but on the other hand, if she spent it on a good cause, it would pay for itself. As spending the money set aside for the surgery was out of the question. Besides, they could lose the trial. No life was more important. So they had to figure something out. I think I can intercept from my father, Julia, someone else, she pondered. I'll try to hook up someone I know, too, Natalia nodded. We'll get through this. So when Alex arrived at the cafe, Emily was chatting with the lawyer. No, it's not like that, she concluded with a sigh, ending the conversation. Why is it? Alex inquired. Looking for lawyers, she replied and outlined the nature of the issue. I think I might be able to help, smiled the new friend. The crisis center has an army of lawyers, and one of them is handling my paperwork. I want to change my last name. Anyway, it's no big deal. I can set you up with him. Stephen Anderson really gave the impression of a competent specialist who knew his business, and most importantly, the law. The next day, the women safely prepared a statement of claim. So, shall we wait for the result? Smiled Sarah. By the way, the surgery's tomorrow. We'll all be holding our fists for you, said Emily seriously, squeezing her hand. Upon learning that his wife had paired up with his ex-fiancée to sue, Michael became furious. What are they up to? Questioned the offended man, pacing the room. Yeah, and how can they beat me? Calm down, replied the mother. Of course you can't overpower me. Then why get so nervous? Alas, Ashley proved to be an unimportant visionary. The court ordered Michael to pay Sarah a substantial settlement. Sarah herself was still weak after the successful surgery and therefore could not attend the meeting. But upon learning the court victory, she cried with joy. I guess there is justice in the world, she thought. Michael had nothing left to do but lay out the money. It took almost all of his assets. 2 days after the funds were transferred, Sarah flew to the sea to undergo a course of rehabilitation Tom took with her. A month later, on the occasion of her return, the whole honest company decided to roll a real feast. But with cooks like my favorite women. It's a cakewalk, Sarah said cheerfully. Emily and Julia really outdid themselves. I think I know what kind of business I'm going to get into, said Sarah. I'm going to buy a restaurant and hire the whole company. At the same time, I'll thank Emily for everything she's done for me. Yeah, I could really use a job right now, Emily replied. Alex and I have decided to buy this house. You and Alex, smiled Sarah slyly. Seems like someone wants to share the news. And actually, yes, smiled Emily. He proposed to me in return.
And you kept quiet, exclaimed Julia. Good friend.
Well, it's just that we wanted to tell you about it when everyone was all together, explained Emily. Well, what did you say? Of course I did, she replied, snuggling up to her newfound fiancé and smiling enigmatically. But that's not all the news. Well, 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 chanted the audience. The three of us are getting married, Emily announced and blushed with embarrassment. John didn't immediately realize what she was talking about, and when finally came to him, the man burst into tears. To think I waited. A grandson or granddaughter. Alex and Emily got married. A month later, they bought a rented house, and while Sarah set up her restaurant business, Tom lived with them. And it couldn't be otherwise. Emily considered the boy her nephew, and the boy thought of her as his aunt. John and Sarah decided to follow suit and got married. The marriage was celebrated in the same lineup. After the opening of the establishment, Sarah hired Emily as a chef. There was room for Sarah and Julia, who had also quit her job at the school cafeteria. These three women did everything to make Sarah Gardner's place the best in town. Working as an orderly, Alex realized that he wanted to devote himself to medicine, and the guy decided to enroll in medical school. He'll do well, his wife admonished him. Thank you, replied Alex, touched by her support. And if anyone was left with nothing, it was Michael. The ugly story had traveled all over town, and he had lost credibility in the eyes of all his business partners. But for Emily and Sarah, it's all in the distant past. Winter was approaching fast this time. Yesterday it was still warm, and couples in love were wandering around parks and kissing. But it had taken 24 hours to make everyone wrap themselves in warm scarves up to their eyes and put away light sweaters. Now they had to dress not for beauty, but to stay warm. Even beggars, who were numerous in warm weather, now preferred to hide in glass pavilions with ATMs. From there, however, they were chased away. "Did you want to help yourself?" a man in his 50s asked sternly, coming in from the cold. He brought a cold draft with him, and the two vagrants who had dozed off immediately woke up. "There's nowhere to rest. They won't let us," grumbled the younger one. "Are we not human beings?" he shouted and headed for the door. The other one didn't even move. "And do you need a special invitation?" the man asked. The tramp smiled crookedly. "I guess I don't look like me at all, since you don't recognize me." He pulled off his hat and ruffled his hair. "Doesn't look like this." "Brian," the man whispered. "Is it really you? How did you get here? Why the bum?" "Bitter," Brian grinned. "Long story, Jeffrey. I'm too lazy to tell. And my throat's dry." He gave the man a sly glance. "Maybe this ruse would work. And then, at least tonight, he'd be fed." It did. Jeffrey pulled a card out of his wallet. "I'll withdraw some now and then we'll go. We'll eat, have a drink. Tell me all about it." Half an hour later, Brian was sitting across from Jeffrey in some cheap cafe, eating his third shawarma. Of course, a tramp wouldn't be allowed in a decent place. One wouldn't dream of it. But who cares if it's warm and even has food?
"What happened to you?" Jeffrey asked. He hadn't gotten himself anything but coffee, but he hadn't touched it either.
Brian searched his eyes for a napkin and, not finding one, wiped his lips with the palm of his hand and sipped his beer. "Started out as me being a fool. Didn't take your advice, Jeffrey. Figured I was a smart kid and could get away with it. So, to make a long story short, I came up with a cunning plan." "What kind of plan?" "Well, listen to this. I wonder if these moms do any parenting at all," Brian thought, cringing at the squealing of children. He himself was lying on the top shelf, trying to fall asleep to the measured clatter of the wheels. But how could he fall asleep to the squeals? They say it's good to sleep on trains. That's a lie. The neighbor from the bottom shelf looked at him guiltily. "Did we wake you up?" "Excuse me, please?" He turned away without answering anything. It was sickening enough as it was. He boarded this train with one single thought persistently drilling into his brain. "I'm broke. I'm a beggar. Not only am I a beggar, but I owe everyone in the world." Realizing this proved to be an impossible task. It's hard to readjust. You still act like a wealthy man. You retain your old tastes and habits, and then you stumble over and over again with undeniable truths. You're left with nothing but debt. Instead of your favorite restaurant, you go to a stall for a hot dog, and instead of throwing away a shoe that has fallen apart, you glue it on. From the usual stores, too, it is better to give up. Now you have to go to the market. It's disgusting, but where to go? 6 months ago he had money, opportunities, and a more or less peaceful life. Now there's no business, no peace of mind, nothing at all, not even money for a separate compartment. He again remembered in detail the day when he could still change something, but who to blame? He himself chose not to listen to the voice of reason and indulged his own stubbornness, and for that he had paid the price. He was awakened by a phone call. That in itself was cause for a bad mood, but it was Jeffrey. He never bothered anyone for nothing. I'd have to answer it. "Hello," he mumbled into the receiver. "Woke you up." "I don't care. Why are you calling?" "Warehouse has caught fire." "Earthquake," Jeffrey replied almost nonchalantly. "It pains me to tell you this, Brian, but I'm afraid our network won't survive the crisis. We need to sit it out, wait it out." "What?" Brian asked sleepily and yawned loudly. "Look, Jeff, I've told you how many times. No working information until 11:00, except for the most urgent. I'm still not awake and not thinking straight anyway."
"Sorry," his interlocutor replied dryly. "You have 40 minutes to wake up. I'm on my way to your place," he passed out.
Brian pulled the blanket off the bed, wrapped himself in it like a cloak, and strode barefoot into the kitchen to warm water. He was desperate for coffee. Brian preferred not to think about what he was going to hear in 40 minutes. He knew damn well, without any smart uncles, that this was a volatile time for business. So what do you want to do? Lower prices or raise salesmen's wages so they don't quit? And how does it coincide with the interests of the business? His cause, by the way. He's a businessman, not a philanthropist. Jeffrey showed up exactly 40 minutes later, as promised, not a second late. Nerd. Precision as the courtesy of King's Brian greeted him. Let's go to the kitchen. I'm waking up in there. Do you want a splash of coffee? No thanks. He sat down at the table and pulled some papers out of his briefcase. Look at this, Brian. He slid his eyes indifferently over neatly filled tables and some boring sheets. Well, what's this? These, Jeffrey picked up the top sheets, are estimates from suppliers. Next is logistics. Look at the payroll here, and here are the electric bills, but most importantly, the monthly reports. How scary. Brian made scary eyes, but Jeffrey didn't even smile. Scary we're in a financial hole, Brian, and before it gets worse. Brian jumped up and walked nervously along the table, adjusting his crooked chair for some reason. So, what's this got to do with? Well, the crisis. Is this the first time? Things will get better soon. I doubt it. It used to get better because people had to go to the stores anyway, buy there, choose from what we are ready to offer them. So now what's changed? Jeffrey sighed. An online marketplace that provides a huge range. Do you have any idea what that is? A monster that will wipe out live commerce at the root, and their prices, mind you, are significantly lower. Now don't be in a hurry. These marketplaces of yours are just a trendy toy that everyone will soon get bored of. People like it when they have the opportunity to smell, touch the goods. You're already scared. People will realize very soon how great it is to shop around the country and compare prices. Reviews save money and time. It used to be the privilege of only the very rich, but now it's available to everyone. Oh, listen to you, it's like everything. It's the end of the world. Not the end, but the best thing we can do now is slow down and go online too and lower prices like everyone else. We'll have to. But we'll be able to win on employee wages. We won't have to pay the salespeople anymore. Look, Brian, I'm not kidding. We're going to lose everything if we don't suspend our operations. Right now, there's still a chance to save anything. In 6 months, it'll be gone. Oh, don't lecture me, Brian snapped back. As we've worked, so we'll work. That's it. There's nothing to talk about.
I should have listened to Jeffrey, Brian thought for the umpteenth time. I should have. But what are you talking about now? You stuck your neck out like a donkey and walked away. Here's your principles. Eat up. Don't be deceived.
On the next shelf, the baby cried again. The mother immediately came up, whispered, took her loud-voiced child in her arms. It didn't help. The baby continued to cry, louder and louder. Brian buried himself in his pillow and covered himself with a blanket. When he stepped off the iron step and onto the platform, he breathed a sigh of relief. How tired was he of this journey? It had been a long time since he had traveled by train. He had always preferred airplanes and was used to business class. But now he had to remember the forgotten past, and it would be better to forget it all back soon. 3 days in a parlor car equaled 3 years in a communal apartment. Children screaming and running back and forth without stopping. Men drink and argue politics out of boredom. Students are a separate problem. Why are they so noisy? They roar like horses. They sing songs to the accompaniment of a guitar, and they're hugging in the vestibule. Thank heavens. It's all over. Now he would come home. The last time he called home his home was 20 years ago. When he left, he hoped with all his heart that he'd never come back here again. But he had to. Life forced him to, and there was no reason to get cocky in front of his acquaintances. The streets familiar from his childhood were bustling with people and cars, but Brian didn't notice the hustle and bustle. It suddenly seemed to him that he was watching some infinitely old movie, where he was 17 years old again. After all, nothing had changed. Well, maybe some new signs have been added. The coffee shop at the station changed its name. It used to be called the Roadhouse. Now it's the Tired Wanderer. But in essence, it's the same as before, and it's like he's back to his old self. No money again, not a dime in his pocket, same as before. Okay, stop whining, he mentally ordered himself. You want to get out of the hole. Not to complain, but to act. Only his mother had agreed to what he had planned. After all, her permission was still required. Once in his yard, Brian stood for a few minutes, looking at the house where he had spent his childhood and part of his youth. How strange. Had he really lived here once? A 5-story gray stone building, small windows with still old-fashioned wooden frames on them. Brian remembered the wonderful thing he'd done when he was a kid, insulating the windows for winter. They used to put absorbent cotton between the frames. It had to be stuffed into the gaps of the closed window so that the wool wouldn't fall out. Additionally, the gap was sealed with painter's tape or just long strips of paper. Indeed, it became warmer. But the window could not be opened until spring, and in spring all this construction was removed. The windows were ceremoniously washed, and one could live quietly until the cold weather. More convenient plastic ones appeared much later. And what kind of junk on the long balconies can be seen? They are still used as storerooms for garbage. The horror. Parking, of course, there is no parking lot. The cars are mostly old cars parked according to the principle of who got up first is the place to go. And there's the merry-go-round she and her friends used to ride in 6th grade. It's still standing there all twisted, and no one had fixed it in all those years. There was a peculiar smell of wet stone in the entryway, so someone had recently scrubbed the floor. But at least they cleaned. He went up to the 3rd floor, stepped to the familiar door, and pressed the bell button. Emily had been on her feet since 6:00 this morning and had run to the market before noon, where she had left almost half of her pension, but it couldn't be otherwise, for her son was coming to visit. The last time they saw each other was 20 years ago, just after Brian received his school-leaving certificate and rushed to the train station the next day to conquer the capital. Conquered, I guess. In any case, he occasionally sent his mother money orders and wished her a happy New Year, and on all her requests to drop by at least for a couple of days. He always said that he was working. No time at all.
Maybe I'll come to you then, she suggested. Cook you something delicious. See how you live. I've never been to your place.
So you'll come and sit at home all day, he asked, and in his voice I could already clearly hear the irritation. Why home? Because you don't know the city. And I only come home for the night. That's it, Mom. Emily hung up the phone and sighed softly. She couldn't forgive herself for living with Brian's father for so long. What kind of example was he setting for his son? All he knew was to get drunk and change mistresses, and no respect for his parents. If it wasn't for Emily, there'd be no one to take care of them. They loved her, called her daughter. She should have divorced her husband, but she didn't have the courage. So the boy saw all that art, grew up selfish, and now he came to see me. How could you not take him in like a human being? Brian loved meat pies and his mom's borscht. So when she got home, Emily rushed into the kitchen to prepare a treat. For the arrival of her favorite son, maybe he'd stay home. Yes, we'll be refreshed. Remember that there are such things as family and the warmth of the hearth. At the sharp ringing of the doorbell, she dropped the spoon she was stirring the roast with. Ah, what a pity that there was no time to tidy up. Now she would appear to her son disheveled, in a robe, without makeup, running past the mirror in the hallway. Emily rubbed her cheeks a little. At least a blush would appear. Emily held out her arms to him. Her son leaned over politely and touched her cheek lightly with his lips.
Hey, Mom, how are you doing?
Something wasn't right. Something wasn't right at all. And it wasn't that it was hard to recognize the 17-year-old boy she remembered in this grown-up, motherly man. It was just that her son looked at her so coldly, studying her, as if it was not his mother standing in front of him, but a complete stranger, perhaps even an adversary. His mother's eyes were faded, as if burned out, like a once bright cloth under the hot southern sun. And something important was missing from them. Brian couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Had she stopped coloring her eyelashes? But when he looked closer, he realized it wasn't her eyelashes. It was just that his mother's eyes were sad. There were no usual sparks of laughter in them. That's strange. Mom was always so cheerful, loved to laugh and infect others with her laughter. What happened to her? So this is how you live, he said, looking around at the old furnishings. The sofa, which he remembered from his early childhood, must be all beaten up. You'd have to lie down, and the springs would be digging into your sides. True, his mother had covered it with an orange plaid, but that was just a trick to hide the worn upholstery. The TV's on the nightstand, and the only new technology is a laptop. What's the mother want it for? I wonder if she's on Classmates. Maybe you watch movies, though. So you're living, you don't change anything. I live the same way, Emily replied. Brian stood up, walked across the room, and looked up. Look, there's a crack in the ceiling, there in the corner. See, he pointed his finger. It's understandable, though, how old this wallpaper is. Not remembering the food, for which he'd lost interest, Brian squatted down, pulled back a corner of the rug, and peered at the floor at the baseboard. What did you ask? There's a gap between the wall and the baseboard. We'll have to put in here, she said. What's that for, Brian? I'm fine as I am, he frowned.
And how are you doing? The woman asked.
Go see for yourself, Emily shrugged. clearly annoyed by her son's questioning. Somehow, this wasn't human. They'd met, and Brian hadn't even hugged her. He hadn't asked her about her health or tasted her mother's treats. She'd tried so hard to please her boy. She'd been looking forward to seeing him. But the son almost immediately began to walk around the apartment, inspecting the shortcomings, and started talking about repairs, as if he hadn't come to his mother's house, but to buy a home. The tiles are almost falling off, and the faucets should be replaced, she said. We'll replace them. We'll replace them. What's wrong, Mom? He sat down again on the chair opposite and looked at her reproachfully. You don't look after the house at all. You've neglected everything. It's going to take a lot of repairs alone. Emily smiled openly, simple-mindedly, like a child. It's true what they say. Old people are like children, Brian thought fleetingly. Where am I going to get the money for repairs, Brian? I can't afford it on my pension. Medicines have gotten expensive. Or haven't you been home in 20 years? You've forgotten how we live here. Stop it, Mother, he grumbled. Forgotten, not forgotten. What does it matter? After all, I've explained it all to you already. There was plenty of work to do. I didn't bend my back for my uncle or sit on a salary like some people. Of course, it's easier for them. You work from 10 to 6 and walk away. Why don't you have any vacations at all? She asked. Employees have vacations, the son said patiently. It was obvious that this conversation was making him nervous. In your own business? It's like the commercials say, work 24/7. If you go away for a week, they'll steal everything. It must be hard. His mother looked at him sympathetically.
Her look made Brian uncomfortable. How infuriating was this kinship thing, wasn't it? He'd long ago considered that he had no kin, and his mother didn't count either.
Yeah, she'd raised him and all that. But first of all, she was legally obligated to take care of him until he came of age. And secondly, he'd already been living on his own for 20 years. Well, she sent him some money at first, but that was a long time ago. And he himself, let's be honest, would never have come here if it weren't for the need. Well, at least you'll stay here, get a break from everything, continued my mother. You want to lie down on the sofa, and I'll bring you some pies. Or maybe it's hot. Better borscht. I made some delicious borscht. Brian mentally cursed. He'd had enough of borscht and pies. He hadn't come here to eat. Thank you, Mother, thank you. But I'm not hungry yet. That's what I've come for. I'm in trouble. What's the trouble? She asked. Emily was alarmed. You're not ill, no. That's different. You see, there's a crisis everywhere now. Money is depreciating, that's right, Mom nodded. Prices change every week. I used to buy milk for 45 rubles, but since Monday it's already 47. And then they have taken the fashion. They write on the price tags large, for example, 47 rubles, and next to a small font 0.99 rubles. But it's almost 48 rubles. No money will be enough. I once met Aunt Lucy in the supermarket, a neighbor from the 4th floor. I remember her son Alex was friends with you. He's a salesman now. He's got a technical degree, Brian wondered. Yeah, Emily grinned wryly. So he's a tech salesman, computers, cell phones. So I met Aunt Lucy and I saw her take a caramel from the ones they sell in bulk and eat it.
Then she walked on and snatched another one again. And believe me, Brian, I'm looking at it and I'm ashamed. I'm hiding behind the racks and I'm not breathing. What's the matter with her? Maybe there's something wrong with her head. He asked her why she was stealing, but her mother shook her stealing. No, son, there's nothing wrong with her head. She just can't afford to buy candy, but she wants to.
Alex can't help her. I've got 2 kids growing up myself. My wife is on maternity leave with them. I felt sorry for her. I went the next day, picked up these caramels. Then I went to her. I said, Lucy, they gave me a treat at work, and I don't like sweets. Take some for yourself. Eat them with your tea so you work. Mother, he rejoiced. If so, maybe I won't have to. Maybe things will be resolved more easily. Jeffrey immediately daydreamed. What kind of work could she do at her age? Well, maybe cleaning somewhere for a penny? That's all the income. Yes, that's right, mopping floors in a bakery, Emily confirmed his guess. Unofficially, of course, they don't pay much, but that's thanks enough, isn't it? I saw Aunt Lucy again the next day, only this time she took an apple and ate it. And it's a good thing she ate some fruit. After that, she didn't buy a little bit, though, but she brought me back change. There's plenty of it. What else is there? He wondered, but he had already forgotten about her. I'll have to go there soon and have a look around. The house is a wreck, of course. It was a wreck 20 years ago, but the land is the land. The main thing is that if the apple trees bear fruit, It's not bad at all. Oh, it's not bad. No, come on, Brian. He cheered himself up. It looks like it's going to work out. It's going to work out. I thought you sold the cottage a long time ago, he said, trying to stealthily turn the conversation to the main topic of his concern. No, Brian, why would I sell it? I grow potatoes, tomatoes, and cucumbers and apple trees on it. If I sell it, I'll have to buy it all at the store. But Brian tried to put the right note of concern and slight worry in his tone. It must be hard for you, traveling back and forth with the crops. The mother sighed heavily. But where to go? You have to live somehow. It's always the same song, Brian thought irritably, tossing and turning on the old and uncomfortable sofa. His mother had made his bed here for a reason. He'd asked for it. The fool, he said. I want to remember my childhood well. Did he remember? The wall clock ticked annoyingly loudly. How could my mother fall asleep to that? Why do these pensioners get so attached to all kinds of junk? Why do I need this watch? Can't you watch the time on your phone? What's this summer house for? Growing an apple tree when apples cost a penny at the store. Buy yourself 10, you'll eat them yourself and have enough left over for your famous Charlotte. But no, you have to go to the DACA. She saves money, you see. And if you calculate, even in a rough way, the travel back and forth, then still water, vegetable garden, irrigation, a lot of effort to grow something there. It's a golden harvest. She saves money, economist. But how pleasant it is to bring her neighbors gifts. For her own money, by the way. Just this, please. And no financial literacy, he thought with a new attack of rage. But in fact, he was angry not so much at his mother as at himself. He hadn't been the smartest either. He hadn't listened to Jeffrey. And now I had to deal with the consequences. Do I look like my mother? Just like her, shallow. The thought was so depressing that Brian immediately felt like a 5-year-old kid who'd been given a book instead of a toy for New Year's Eve. He wanted to resent the whole world, crawl under the couch and start crying. Except he's not 5 anymore. Oh, not 5. And instead of a disgusting book, he got a collapse of business and complete lack of money. And you can't just crawl under the couch. Emily couldn't sleep either. Her son's unimportant sudden arrival, his strange aloofness, it was confusing. Why had he come, when from all appearances he didn't miss his mother at all? Didn't Emily miss him? Emily had a way of appearing like a simple-minded retired grandmother when necessary, but she really wasn't. In her conversation with her son, she deliberately left out a lot of things. For example, that her job was not scrubbing floors in the bakery. Having retired, Emily with a month of bewilderment, and then realized to sit idle, a luxury is not for a pensioner. To get a job, of course, was difficult. At every interview, she was politely refused. Age, I'm sorry, we have a young team, or even simpler, will you be on sick leave? You have a line to the doctor, the hospital, the dispensary, and we pay you. It was offensive to hear this, so she decided not to waste time. She called her previous place of work, talked to young people, and learned that it was possible to earn money from home. Emily decided to keep up with life and continued to work, but already, as they say now, on a remote.
And why not? For an experienced accountant, this is a very good opportunity. Of course, she was going to tell Brian about it. She wanted to brag about her success, but then she realized, no, it was too soon to share the news. It was better to keep quiet for now. Something told her that her son hadn't come for nothing, but for some very specific reason that he wasn't telling her about. And if that was the case, it would be wise for her to wait with revelations for the time being. She didn't say that it had been 5 years since love had come into her life.
Although it would be more accurate to say, returned. She and Ethan had known each other for a long time, since high school. Emily, then just Em, studied in a parallel class with Ethan, and every time she met the blue-eyed handsome boy in the school corridors, she felt her heart sink. Emily had never dreamed of the attention of such a guy, who was secretly admired by half of the high school girls. Ethan could choose any girl he wanted, and there were smart girls who were going for a gold medal, or at least a silver medal. There were also beautiful ones. Take Sarah Johnson. Oh, what a girl she was. Tall, statuesque, with a thick blonde braid below her knees, black eyes like an Italian mother, and what eyelashes, dark, thick, with a beautiful curve. When she lowered her eyes, the shadow of these luxurious eyelashes fell in a semicircle on her cheeks. And besides the smart and pretty ones, there were also the talented ones. Laura, who could sketch a portrait of anyone in 5 minutes. Kate was a local celebrity who played in all the school plays. Emily, on the other hand, was just an ordinary girl. She studied easily, moderately hard, but she was never an honors student, nor did she want to be. No one would call Emily a beauty, but not a dunce either, so pretty, no more than that. and Emily didn't have any creative ability. No, she had nothing to attract attention. And she didn't need to. There were plenty of other girls. She thought Ethan didn't even notice her. But one mysterious incident changed everything. Once, when she returned in the early spring morning, Emily found on her windowsill a fresh branch of lilacs, still in dew. The lilacs were large, beautiful, and smelled so intoxicating that she could hold them in her hands all day long. When Emily looked out the window, she saw no one, and then she had to pack up and run to school. So the incident slipped her mind pretty quickly. But the next morning it happened again. An open window and a fragrant branch. What's the mystery? No one around. On the way to school, Emily thought that boys were strange creatures after all. But what was the point of all those flowers if it wasn't clear who was giving them? At least this mysterious admirer would write a note. Otherwise, you want to come up. Thank you. But to whom? There were still 10 minutes before the beginning of classes, and in the schoolyard reigned the usual fun bustle. Friends were saying hello to each other. Someone, sitting on the porch, was hurriedly finishing his homework. A little farther away, at the fence, Emily saw Ethan, surrounded by a flock of girls. They were smart and beautiful, and even talented, and all of them, interrupting each other, talked about the approaching graduation. Ethan didn't take part in the discussion, but let the girls talk. Emily stopped nearby, pretending to look for something in her briefcase. It's spring, exams are coming up, and our graduation will be there, Kate sighed suddenly. And we'll go our separate ways. Maybe we'll never see each other again. I'm going to New York. I want to go to acting school. You, Ethan, into the army. Jessica's going to New York too. Why don't we go together? No way, the other one replied. Personally, I'm staying here. I'll get married. A woman, if she's beautiful, has no reason to hustle. To work, Kate bit her lip resentfully, and the other girls giggled. She never missed an opportunity to emphasize who was the first beauty here, and at the same time to humiliate the competitors. So the crowd was happy that this time it was not them. Well, if there are no other talents than beauty, then the best thing to do is to get married, Kate thought. Who are you going to marry? Well, see, then I have no one to marry. You'd better tell me what dress I should wear to the prom. Blue or lilac, Ethan said suddenly, and looked at Emily intently. Yeah, I really like lilac, Emily shuddered, blood rushing to her face. And, agonizingly afraid of blushing, she hurried off to class. Now that so many years had passed, Emily sometimes asked herself, why did she get so embarrassed? Why? Wasn't it hard to at least smile at a guy in love? After all, he was probably expecting it. But to her, raised in modesty, it seemed that the handsome Ethan just decided to make a joke on an unattractive girl. And when 40 years later they met quite by chance, being in the same checkout line at the store, Ethan, remembering the past, admitted, "Remember when I said about the lilacs?" Well, of course I remember. Only I couldn't have imagined that you did. Silly Ethan reproached himself without malice. I should have approached you myself, and I was shy, walking in circles, and you blushed so much. It was immediately clear to me that you guessed. I thought that since you ran away so quickly, it means that you didn't like me. No, Ethan, just the opposite. Really, you thought that, didn't you? You know, I really wanted to try my luck again at the prom, to ask you to dance, to ask you directly. But you didn't come to the prom. I did, Emily confessed embarrassedly. I got chicken pox right before prom. You know, there was no way I was going to make it. Oh, I was so upset. It's funny to remember now. But then I looked at my new dress, and I cried. I roared until my mom took it out of my sight. She looked with a smile at this grown-up man, but so touching in his memories of his first love. How little did you know about girls, Ethan? And here I thought you were a sophisticated young man, a womanizer by then. Yes, he laughed, and I wasn't. But the girls were after you, and they were after you big time, and don't deny it. I've seen it all, I did, Ethan agreed, but I didn't need them. I was in love with you. I guess I should have been more decisive. Oh, what the hell? Listen, I invite you to visit. You don't have to be jealous. My wife won't be here. I mean, we're, almost classmates. Let's go. I agree, Emily replied. Besides, there's no one to be jealous of. I separated from my husband a long time ago. Ethan took her bags and shook his head, and I was too embarrassed to ask why you were carrying such heavy things yourself. And it turns out, too bad you don't. I was sure you'd be able to build a strong, happy family. I can't tell you how happy I was when my husband finally left. Ethan stopped and looked at her confused. Happy? You were happy? Very, Emily laughed. You know, better no husband than a drinking, philandering one. And the worst of it was that I wouldn't have left him myself. You haven't forgotten how we were brought up, have you? It was a shame to get divorced. If we got married, we had to live together. So we lived together. And then there was such happiness. He found someone else and went to her, and I'm free. You wouldn't believe it. Ethan and I danced all over the apartment that day. And then I baked a cake and sat in front of the TV and cut myself a huge piece. I sat on the couch, eating, and some comedy was on, I remember. And this feeling that I don't have to agree anymore, that I don't have to wiggle my way through the evening. To understand, to justify. Oh, that was a relief. Ethan and I promised myself that I would never take my husband back. And he begged and begged. But I'd already tasted freedom once.
You always knew how to surprise me, Emily, he said.
And you know, I'm happy you haven't changed, she replied. He helped her carry her bags all the way to her apartment. And then they just sat in the kitchen, drinking flavored tea and talking. They had a lot to tell each other about all the untold things of their youth and what came afterward. So imperceptibly, without noise and a stormy boil of passions, in Emily's life came love. It was the love of two adults, many experienced people, care for each other, respect and warmth. That's what their relationship consisted of. And Emily often thought that nothing better than that had ever happened to her. But Brian didn't know anything about it yet, and would he? She had a sudden urge to call Ethan right now, to talk to him, to hear his voice. But it was nighttime. There wouldn't be a man. With a sigh, Emily rolled over onto her side, closed her eyes, and began counting sheep like a child. Early in the morning, Brian found his mother in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, wrapped in a shawl, absent-mindedly stirring her tea. Seeing her son, Emily smiled. Something's been keeping me awake. You started to tell me yesterday that you were in some kind of trouble, but somehow you never finished. Brian sat up and poured himself some tea as well. Trouble. That's putting it mildly, he said with a heavy sigh. In fact, I'm in what you might call a disaster. Everything I've worked for so many years has gone to waste. He raised inflamed eyes to his mother. Everything you know? My business just got eaten up by the competition. Bandits? Emily asked fearfully.
No, the recession. Those businessmen with their online stores who started slashing prices, that's how they tore everything down.
I can't. They can, but I can't. They don't have rent for retail space. They don't have such expenses for utilities. They don't have to pay the vendors. And you, can't you go online like them? I can, but I have to pay off my debts first, and I don't have any money. I've already sold everything I can get my hands on. Oh, Brian's mother was shocked into silence. Sure, Brian was far from a perfect son, but he was still a son. She felt sorry for him. He'd worked for so many years, never been home, never had a family of his own, and to be left with nothing in one fell swoop. I'll get out, he said firmly.
I'll get out. But you've got to help me, you know. I need to get this apartment vacated, and the summer house too. Then I can put some money into renovations and rent out both. That'll keep me going. And then I'll find a job. But right now, holding on is the most important thing. You see, Mom's confused. She's not the same anymore, Brian said.
Where am I supposed to go? How am I going to get you out of your apartment? Emily asked. I've already thought of that, he answered so quickly that there was no doubt. He had indeed thought of everything. We'll put you in a nursing home. Temporarily, until I'm up again. In the meantime, you'll have to live there. Why? They'll feed you, and the doctors will look after you. So you won't even have to go to the clinic, and you won't have to socialize with just anyone, but with quite decent people. But I'll visit. How can you? And then when this black streak is over, I'll take you away. Well, you know, Brian and Emily stood up and wrapped her shawl more tightly. I didn't expect this from you. What did you expect? He asked dejectedly. That I'd go back to my native land and go to work as a janitor. I'd rather be a janitor than put my mother in an almshouse. There you go again. He struck the table with his fist in annoyance. What almshouse? A normal institution for the elderly. It's not like I'm throwing you out on the street. After all, why don't you help your son? You haven't shown your face around here in 20 years, and now all of a sudden you remember you're a son. No, Brian, you can't expect that kind of help from me, and I don't want to hear any of it. But Mom, he tried to put a childishly whimsical note in his voice. Not for long. Just for a couple months, and then I'll take you away. That's right. Emily turned away from the window, and the sunny spring day suddenly seemed gray and dirty, as if a child had been painting with watercolors and then spilled water from a glass on the fresh drawing. So that was why Brian had come, to put his mother in a nursing home, and to take possession of the cottage and provide himself with the standard of living to which he was accustomed. Again, the old remorse woke up and clawed at her heart. It is my fault. I put up with a worthless husband because of stupid conventions and made my son put up with it. Every day he saw his own father despised and hated by everyone but the bottle. I should have gotten a divorce. I should have what did Brian grow up to be, exactly like his dad. The only difference is that to his father all that mattered was the booze, but to Brian nothing matters but money. Suddenly she felt disgusted with herself, weak and unable to transcend the rules no one wanted, afraid of being judged. Who would judge her? Neighborhood gossipers, colleagues at work. But after all, she could trade the apartment and move out of here, and she could quit her job and find another one. Maybe I deserve all this, Emily thought. And now she was paying for what she'd done. Where are you going to live yourself, she asked. I'll rent a doghouse, but that'll do for a while. And we'll see, she nodded. Then silently she left the kitchen and went to her room to pack. Not much junk, Brian said, taking the suitcase from her. He picked it up and shook it gently. Clearly the suitcase was half empty. Only things that are truly dear to me are in there, Mother said. Old photographs, letters, and a few favorite books. The rest is yours to dispose of as you wish. A cab pulled up to the house, and Brian took Emily's hand. Well, get settled in. Let me give you a hand. He himself settled into the front seat and nodded nonchalantly to the driver. You know the Hope Nursing Home? Drive there. Emily stared out the window without looking away. They were met at the entrance by a smiling person. Good afternoon. I'll show you to your room. You show me, Brian said impatiently, and tossed his suitcase to his mother. And I have business to attend to. Sorry, I'm in a hurry. He walked quickly back to the waiting car. It worked. It all worked. His heart sang joyfully. For the time being, he would rent out his mother's dacha, and in a couple of months he would talk to her so that she would reissue everything to him. And then he would go up again, sell it, and be able to invest the money in business. Just 2 or 3 months to wait, just nothing. And it's better to get a job now. Then the money from the rent will be able to save. By the way, the job was the easiest. He had already had time to look through the vacancies and sent responses to a couple of good places. Everything had worked out fine. Let's go back now, he commanded the cabbie, and make it quick. I'm getting hungry. He wasn't lying. Indeed, for the first time in the few days he had spent in his hometown, he felt a beastly appetite. Until today, he'd had trouble forcing himself to eat anything. Now he would eat it in one sitting without choking on it. It was getting hotter and hotter outside. Brian was glad to expose his face to the sun's gentle rays. It felt good. Emily sat on the bed in her new home and looked sadly at her surroundings. The bare walls were neatly painted a pastel pink color, but there were no pictures, no vase with a flower, and there were no curtains on the windows, blinds. The bed is made almost like a soldier's, a blanket, a plaid, a pillow in a corner. There's a desk by the window. There's a nightstand by the bed, clean, pleasant. A cozy place for those who have nowhere else to go. She pulled out her cell phone and called the one person who still cared about her. Ethan. Ethan cheered. I was just about to call you myself. Do you want to go to a movie? I'll be busy until 6, and I can pick you up by 7:30. No, she begged. You don't have to pick me up. You see, I've moved here. Where at this hour? Ethan wondered. Emily, please don't speak in riddles.
Explain where you moved to and why, she said. Emily felt a lump come up to her throat and barely managed to swallow it. Brian's here. He's lost all his money. He needs an apartment to rent out, and I
see, Ethan hissed. Give me the address. I'll be there soon. Ethan, don't. The address, Emily.
I can find out myself, but it will be longer.
All right, write it down.
Ethan arrived an hour after the call.
Why didn't you tell me everything right away? He asked. Why didn't you call right away, before you even got here? Emily lowered her eyes. I was so embarrassed. Ethan, what would I have told you? That my son kicked me out of the house. I don't know why he acted like a scoundrel, and I'm ashamed for some reason. She took his hand. Listen to me and try to understand. I'm very sorry for him. I couldn't make up my mind to get a divorce, and that's how it came about. Brian didn't have a good example in front of him, only a bad one. I felt like I had to keep my family together so Brian wouldn't grow up without a father. I didn't realize at the time that I would rather have no father than a father like that, and now I'm paying the price for that indecision. It's my fault my son grew up like this. He was silent for a moment, pulling Emily's head to his shoulder. I don't think that's true, he said. No matter how hard you try, you can't be a perfect parent. Everyone makes mistakes, but when you become an adult, you have to raise yourself. You can't put everything on your parents, and you can't take all the blame. Brian's a big boy, and I wish I'd never gotten him. I would never have let him send you here. And I'm not going to let you stay here. This is a place for lonely people with no one to take care of them. You're not alone, you have me. Pack up, we're leaving now. But where to? I don't have a home. I have nowhere to go.
What do you mean, where? To me, of course, he looked at his beloved with a definite reproach. Emily, for 5 years I've been begging you to be my wife, and you've resisted. Well, I hope that at least now you will not object. Eh? Or are you going to look for reasons again?
I can't do that, she sighed. But how can we live together? We're not married yet. When she saw the man's eyes widen in amazement, she laughed merrily.
Brian was almost happy. He had been invited to an interview at a great place, perhaps the best place in this city. A large marketing agency. There are always great prospects there, and besides, he was a good fit for them. His knowledge of the field is expert, to say the least. As a marketer, he's a genius. He may have lost one business, but he did not give up and built a clear plan, and most importantly, he found the money for its realization.
That's, talent. Talent. The interview was scheduled for 11:00, but already from 07:00, Brian had not found a place. When was the last time I was this anxious, he asked himself. But he couldn't remember. Even before his first date in his life, he had been almost calm, well, a little shy, but certainly not this much excitement, although of course it's understandable. A date is just a date. A lot depends on the results of the interview, maybe even everything. Of course there are other vacancies, and sooner or later he will get a job somewhere. But he wanted this agency, a solid position, high salary, and with all the new opportunities. After all, had he spent so much time building his own business for nothing? And not somewhere, but in the capital, where competition and for every meter of space sharks so much that only have time to dodge. And he'd been dodging for 2 decades. Humming, Brian tied his tie and once again meticulously assessed his appearance in the mirror. Everything was fine. Except that he'd fluffed his hair a little, giving himself a little deliberate carelessness. It's only the small clerks who always walk around polished, as if their wives had combed their hair an hour before they went out, like Don Corleone. A really serious man doesn't need such nonsense. Everything was perfect now. The office was right in the center of town, and Brian, finding himself in a bustling, crowded street, experienced a new burst of energy, just like in the capital. He loved its frenzied rhythm, life at breakneck speed. I miss it, he thought. Nothing. Soon, very soon, all this will be over. All this mess. And he could finally go back to where he felt good. He didn't call his mother on purpose. Let her miss him more. Then there would be a better chance that she wouldn't be stubborn and would be more willing to sign all the papers. True, Emily hadn't called him either. But Brian put that down to a simple resentment. It's a well-known fact. Women first get offended. And then, when they realize that no one is going to ask for their forgiveness, they get bored. So don't interfere with this process. I'm here for an interview, Brian informed the girl at the reception desk. My name is... I know, she smiled broadly. You're the only suitable applicant so far. Come on in.
They went up to the second floor.
I like your place already, Brian said, looking around. Beautiful renovations, lots of colors, and the location is great. It's a policy of our management, she replied. Ethan Smith believes that employees should feel as good as possible at work. Otherwise, they won't be much use.
That Ethan Smith is a fool, Brian thought gloomily. If you give these employees a free hand, they'll stop working at all. But they don't forget to demand a pay raise.
By the way, the girl continued, Ethan Smith conducts all interviews personally. So now you'll meet him too. Hold on a second. Ethan Smith turned out to be an imposing man and hardly older than 60. Cheerful Grandpa, Brian thought. It's true that such people have a hard time accepting new things. They like to work the old-fashioned way, but maybe we'll get along. It wouldn't take long anyway. Ethan Garcia, meanwhile, was quickly making some notes in his diary. When he saw the visitor, he looked up. Come in, take a chair, have a seat. Thank you.
So I've reviewed your resume, and overall I like it, but there are a few questions.
Please ask, Brian smiled.
Well, okay, let's get started. You were the owner of your own business in New York City. Here you have it stated here that it lasted for quite a while. What changed?
Some financial difficulties due to the recession. Debts, but I'm going to repay them little by little. I see. So why did you suddenly decide to move to our city? Why didn't you stay in the metropolis? After all, you probably have connections there and a better chance of getting a high-paying job than in the provinces.
Brian gritted his teeth. What an intractable old man, he thought.
I had to sell off all my possessions to pay off my debts, he said. So it's all very trivial. I just don't have a place to live in Norway.
Do you have any relatives here?
Yes, my mother. She unfortunately needs special care, so she lives in a boarding house for the elderly. That's how it is. Ethan Garcia smiled. I was under the impression that Emily was quite an independent person. So do you two know each other? And close enough. Emily is my fiancée. As for you, boy, Ethan Garcia rose from the table. Trust me, you won't get a job in this town. And I wouldn't advise you to hope for an inheritance either. I'll make sure you puppy don't get any of what your mama owns and will continue to own. How can you? Get away, Ethan Garcia interrupted him. In parting, I will give you one piece of advice after all. Get out of this town and don't come back here. There's nothing here for you. That's the story. Jeffrey finished his tale. Brian drank his beer in a gulp. I had to use my last dime to get tickets and go. Where was I supposed to go? Came back to the Big Apple, thought I'd make some money. I still had some connections after all. But what? Nothing. Don't you know the ins and outs of this town? As long as you're on top, everyone adores you and wants to be friends with you. If you lose everything, you lose your friends, your buddies first. What's your mother? Jeffrey asked.
Brian shrugged. I don't know. She's doing okay, I guess. Sends me a little money every once in a while. Doesn't want to talk. She's understandable.
It's understandable. I wanted to take everything I had from her, so I'm not offended. He stood up from the cheap plastic chair and smiled. Jeffrey, thank you, brother, for dinner. I'm gonna go. Where are you going? The man wanted to stop him, but restrained himself in time. What could he do? Offer Brian a place to sleep or a job to a man who had just talked without any embarrassment about sending his mother to a nursing home to take possession of her property. His own mother. And is it hard to imagine what such a man is capable of doing to a stranger, even one who would lend him a helping hand? No, you can't. It is too dangerous. Goodbye. Brian tossed over his shoulder, heading for the exit. Jeffrey's lips trembled. Goodbye, he whispered soundlessly. And a roll of black. Please, Maggie added and sighed. With her mind, she knew that she should get used to it. She wasn't a little girl. But somewhere inside something froze desperately every time she had to go to the store, or to the post office, or any place that required contact with human society. Now it was happening all over again. No, she wasn't going to cry at the unfair offense. She'd outgrown that long ago, but still. Don't meet anyone's eyes. Don't respond to angry, cruel words. Just exist in the present moment. Live, breathe, do what you need to do, and then exist in the next moment, and so on, endlessly. This strange but unexpectedly effective advice was given to her by Vivian, a colleague at work, and as Maggie knew for sure, almost the only living soul who was not disgusted by her. You, Maggie, be strong, Vivian had told her more than once. Build up your thick skin like a hippopotamus. But it wasn't easy to follow that good advice. It seemed to Maggie that she would be happy to exchange bodies with a hippopotamus and spend her life in Africa, splashing in the cool waters of the Nile or Lake Titicaca. But reality was not magical, materialistic, and ruthless to the extreme for someone like her. We're out of powdered milk, Lexi said, stretching her immense muffin shape after looking at the lower shelves for what she was asking for. Are you going to get fresh? I will. Maggie nodded. Do they have plain condensed milk? Or only with coffee? Oh, can you hurry up? There's people waiting. And I have to go to Edie's for cheese. Taya, the mother of a large family, who had to go to the store as a breath of fresh air, because at that time the 4 youngest children were left under the care of the 5th eldest 12-year-old Timmy. Come on, Taya. Nick, the tractor driver and the village's main joker, grinned with a gap-toothed smile. Can't you see that Maggie wants to sweeten her life for us? What else can she do but eat condensed milk and chocolates, eh? Other joys of woman's life. At these words, Nick winked and dashingly snapped his cap. I don't see any, you know. A chuckle passed along the line like a breeze over dry grasses. It was almost harmless, but with a subtext Maggie knew well. You're a stranger to us. You're not like us and you're flawed. We should pity you. But we don't want to. You're not worthy of pity, so we'll mock you. That's your lot. Accept it. and don't you dare resist our fun. In general, Maggie never really thought about how many people in the village of New York cannot tolerate it, in fact, and how many participates in this collective bullying, so to speak, for company. She had only recently learned about what had been happening to her since she was a young girl, which is exactly what the name of this phenomenon is: collective bullying, at the suggestion of Vivian. Working in a library brings people together. And two single women, even more so. Maggie had come here exactly 3 years ago, right out of high school. And in fact, without any education should not have been accepted, but Vivian put in a word with Freddie the head and said that Maggie the girl is Nachitnya smart, and since the library willing to go to work, the queue is not behind the threshold, so we must take Maggie. For Maggie, the world changed for the better for the first time in years. She had a job, and even if it paid very, very little, but it was enough for her. There was enough to pay for light and other utilities, enough to eat the simplest things and the rest. Maggie still wore the clothes that her mother had bought. New bought a jacket, demi-seasonal and winter boots, and let the quality was market, and if carefully worn, not 1 year enough. Neither cosmetics, nor jewelry, nor even all sorts of things in the house unnecessary Maggie did not buy. Just no need. Once there were aspirations for all sorts of material things, but then, when it became finally and ruthlessly clear what it all somehow lost meaning. And now Maggie saved herself in books. Oh, books. New York's library collection was rich. Classics, that is, naturally, first of all, and in a huge assortment. But there were also a lot of novelties. The superintendent, with Vivian's support, kept an eye on that. And Vivian regularly replenished the collection with what she herself had bought and read. I don't like to reread, she once explained. How many more books are waiting for me, so why go back to the old ones? So let people rejoice. And the first person to rejoice was Maggie. Vivian never said so, but she had chosen some of the new books to please her young assistant. They say that life is more interesting than any book. Vivian liked to repeat with various variations of details. And I'll tell you this, what kind of life should it be to be cooler than that detective story? Well, in the red cover, last month with you read. No, let such interesting adventures remain on the pages of books, otherwise you may not leave alive. Or in life, if you are very lucky, you will meet one love. But here, you open books and once so many interesting men, and all sorts of different. They're you and noble aristocrats, and brave detectives, and generous millionaires. No, Maggie, personally I from books, no matter what happens in life, no way will not give up. They're my bread. 45-year-old Vivian was born, raised and married here in New York. She knew little Maggie and her mother. But then, after her husband, who went to earn a lot of money, Vivian went to a distant city. Only that did not add up great hopes. Her husband died tragically in an accident at a construction site, and Vivian returned to her small homeland. She got a job in the same place where she used to work in the library. Maggie hurriedly put away her purchases in a cloth shopping bag. She didn't like plastic bags because she had read in a magazine how they were harmful to the environment. Her lips tightened, her eyes widened a little, an unconscious expression on her face, a concentration that helped her stay in the moment, and not to throw haggard glances around, reproachful, questioning, why are you doing this to me, people? After paying for her purchases, Maggie left the store. No, did you see that? Exclaimed Annie, a woman who came into the store strictly once a week when her roommate brought in his paycheck to buy hot drinks and snacks. Did you see her face? Yes, we have, Taya snorted derisively. She went out all proud and didn't even look at people. Annie continued to murmur. She walks around like that, like she's out of this world. She should have accepted that she was ugly and not made a fool of herself. Outside there was the smell of a near thunderstorm and bittersweet cherry blossoms, and the wind was driving a dusty little whirlwind along the road. But higher up, the air was clean and fresh, full of the life-giving succulence of the grasses. The wind was coming from the side of the meadow by the Nesmiana River. Maggie tilted her head back and squeezed her eyes shut, inhaled deeply into her lungs and belly, and exhaled slowly. She opened her eyes and squinted at the disk of the sun sinking slowly toward the horizon. Evening was coming. I was done with business for the day. It had been a long day off, which she'd spent doing some house cleaning. Tomorrow, back to work. But tonight, well, of course she would spend it with a book. Maggie could read fast, as Vivian said, swallow literature. She hurried to her house, which stood at the very edge of the village, and was one of its oldest buildings. The foundations, according to archival documents, were laid at the end of the 19th century. We laid out our purchases and made tea, 1/3 black and 2/3 herbs and berries, a fragrant selection bought from Eddie, a perky old man who traded not only with the locals but also at the market on weekends. Edie was probably the second person, after Vivian, who treated Maggie really well. The girl had changed into her home clothes, a cozy fleece suit of pants and a hooded sweatshirt, pink in color. Her hair, which had been bundled up for the day, was loose, combed and braided. Her mother had taught her to do that. I corrected the pendant on the gold chain around her neck. It was twisted while she was changing clothes, and squeezed it in her palm for a moment. Only this jewelry I had worn since childhood. Only it, in fact, remained as a reminder of my mother. "Oh, it's already cold," Maggie exclaimed, realizing that she had frozen in the middle of the house, and hurriedly poured tea into a cup, added boiling water, and finally, opening a bag of gingerbread with jam filling, sat down in a cozy old plush armchair, covered her feet with a plaid and opened a book, a new novel from her favorite author, and of course about love. No, Maggie read all sorts of genres, but on days like this, when it was especially nauseating, she wanted something light, with humor, and that necessarily with a happy ending. And also, Maggie didn't even tell Vivian this, but when she read, she always imagined herself in the shoes of the main character. That is, she imagined that she, Maggie from New York, is Stella, Jessica, Angelica, Suzanne, or some other person. Beautiful, so that men would fall at her feet. Strong and independent, but hungry for love, which would surely catch up with her. And once, when Maggie was very young, about 12 years old, she thought that when she grew up, her life would be happy, interesting, and just like in the book. Then, in that happy time, Mommy was still alive, and the curse stain seemed like a small, annoying blemish. Then it was no bigger than a fingernail, and sat above her upper lip on the right side of her face, just as a lady of the gallant age had unsuccessfully tried to draw a fly with pink blush. "Daughter, what are you doing that for?" Ellen exclaimed, finding Maggie with a tube of her foundation. "Mommy, I'm learning how to put on makeup." "Why?" Ellen snatched the cream from her hands. "Isn't it a little early for you? How old are you? And then, I bought you a set of children's cosmetics lip gloss, cherry-scented perfumed water, and shiny shadows." Mom Maggie sighed and her voice shook. I want to hide this," and she jabbed her finger at a spot. Well, what a silly thing to say. Ellen crouched down beside her daughter. Maggie was sitting on the floor, drenched in the slanting rays of the sun. "It's just a little spot. It doesn't spoil you at all. People have moles, don't they? It's nothing to worry about. Don't give me any ideas. Come on, get up, let's go. Let's go make beet soup, daughter, dinner's coming soon." Maggie really stopped worrying about the stain. She loved her mother very much and trusted her in everything. They lived soul to soul, and when Daddy was alive, everything was wonderful. We lived as a happy family. And then after Maggie lost her father, Mommy died too. The doctors said it happens, one heart failure, and then you're gone. And there was nothing to be done. Grief had entered the house on the eve of a festive, joyous day. Maggie was going to celebrate her coming of age. And now, of course, it was no longer a holiday. What was there to it? Maggie did not understand how to go on living. Thank you, there were kind people. That is, one kind person, Vivian. She took the orphan girl under her wing and helped with everything. And the funeral, and the wake, and then for Maggie, her things collected and took her to her home. Maggie lived there for 2 months, before Vivian decided that the girl, perhaps a little bit hidden her grief deep in the soul, and can safely leave her alone. But even though Vivian was kind and caring, still, with the loss of her mother, something broke in Maggie. And what she'd once had the strength to fight against now came like a tsunami. The stain on her face began to spread when she was 16. It went up and to the side, sliding down, absorbing part of the lip and chin, and poured purple, like a ripe raspberry. There wasn't much money in the little family, but her mother took Maggie to doctors. But those doctors said there was nothing they could do about it. Remove the stain surgically was not possible, lighten in beauty centers. Well, theoretically it was possible, but not to the end, and at such a cost that is unrealistic. Maggie, of course, understood everything. And the people around reminded. People asked what the hell is going on, and also did not hesitate to express their opinions about what an ugly thing it is. And that now, of course, in the future, Maggie will not be attracted to any normal man. But that was the mildest. So shortly before the final exam, someone started a rumor around the school that Maggie is contagious. And what a mess. The principal, the head teacher, and the school nurse were able to calm the students and their parents and convince them that no, Maggie could be among people and would not harm anyone. Naturally, it was impossible to study well in such conditions. And then there was the death of her mother. In general, Maggie finished school and then did not want to think about higher education. No, she'd already decided for herself that she wanted to live quietly and see less people. And the future, prospects. Well, that's for normal people, not for ugly people. And of course, there was a time when Maggie tried to cover up a blemish with makeup. Only there was a problem. The skin in this place was characterized by painful sensitivity, and on all the cosmetics that she tried, her face began to burn and bake. It itched, and even the rash went to the neck and arms. And then Maggie decided that's it, enough. Apparently. Fate? The universe? Some kind of evil fate. Whoever and whatever was behind all this, I guess it was her destiny to live her whole life as a freak. Good morning. Vivian was in her usual good mood. It would have been annoying for any other person, but Maggie was used to it, and even thought secretly that Vivian was like a battery for her. She didn't let her fall into despondency when it was really hard. After saying hello, Maggie went to the back of the room to sort through the new arrival of books. Vivian and the head of the library went along with her without any special requests. Understanding everything, Maggie never checked out books. She worked in the bowels of the institution, putting everything in its place, entering it into catalogs, putting things in order, sometimes fixing wrinkled books. In general, she had enough to do. Vacation's coming up, Vivian said at lunchtime. Maybe we could go away together, huh? Not far. It will be inexpensive, she continued in a soft, delicate tone, and comfortable for you. Vivian thought it was a catastrophic problem that Maggie was locked up at home on weekends and vacations. Yes, the salary of the librarian was not great, but it was possible, for example, at least in a sanatorium for a short time to get out, or, for example, to go on a hike in the picturesque places. Only Maggie was as stubborn as a bull. A donkey, a tour, and even as stubborn as she could, it seems, only she alone. I'd like to go to Venice for the carnival, she said thoughtfully. Yes, Vivian looked up. So you are interested in the culture of Italy? That's right. They have a wonderful cuisine and the history of Venice's canals. Because they wear masks at carnival, Maggie said with grim amusement. Oh, come on, girl. Her colleague clinked her cup against the saucer with emotion. You can't do that. You can't throw your life away. I understand, she sighed and continued, calmer. It's not easy, but you can't despair. You're going to be happy. Let yourself go out into the world and take your place in it. Maggie shrugged, and for the rest of the lunch hour they were both silent. I'd like that, she said suddenly, turning to Vivian, a stack of novels under her chin. Only. There are no miracles in life. It was 30 minutes till the library closed. Maggie. Vivian shouted, throwing on her beige coat. Will you close it yourself tonight? I have to go home. It's urgent. The plumber's coming. The kitchen's about to burst. He's coming from the district center. All the parts I need, everything. In general, it's very necessary. You go. Don't worry, Maggie said from behind a rack of history books. I'll close it, you go. She was already closing the library herself. It was no big deal. But then the door slammed. Maggie thought that Vivian must have forgotten something. But she would have said a word. She was a talker. And there was silence. Maggie looked out from the back of the room, a late visitor. Not a tidy man, he'd left the door open. And it was raining again outside with hail. Having slammed the door and thinking that maybe it was the children playing around, Maggie went back. It remained to put a couple of books on the shelf and she could leave. But suddenly she froze. A black shadow flashed at the edge of her field of vision. Had she imagined it? Vivian had turned out almost all the lights in the library when she left. Maggie frowned, snickering, what nonsense. She's the only one here. And as if on purpose in refutation of that thought, there was a rustling behind her. Who's there? The dark shadow again, now at her side and slightly ahead. It seemed to move in circles around the lonely librarian. "Excuse me, we're just closing up," Maggie shouted into the gloom in a shaky, cheerful voice. "What did you want?" She froze again. She held her breath. Quiet. Empty. Only the creaking of an old tree somewhere out there, Vivian joked. Lived rats who spent their nights reading books on witchcraft and sorcery, hoping to gain power and enslave the village. Nonsense. A deep inhale and exhale. Slowly inhale and exhale. She's alone. It's okay. Maggie turned to walk to the wall, turn out the lights, and leave, locking the library. But then the black spot jumped out from behind the shelving unit in front of her. And in the middle of it was a milky whiteness, which was the old woman's face, riddled with deep wrinkles, with deep-set eyes and a hooked nose. The mouth, which seemed to have no lips at all, opened, giving Maggie a warm, moist breath. "I need you. I found you. Swap child, I found you. I need you." Maggie had never seen a horror movie. She never read scary books. She was generally averse to anything scary. Vivian once joked that modern man should not be afraid of scary movies. They help to bear all sorts of bad things in life. Because after you looked at the monster from the depths of the caves, which ate half the city, why should you shake, say, from an overdue payment on your loan? But Maggie disagreed with her. And now, perhaps, she thought, was Vivian right about something? Because, well, really, it's just some old stranger dressed in black who sneaked into the library and pounces with incomprehensible cries. What's there to be afraid of? She was scared. How weak. Her heart skipped a beat. Her legs felt like cotton. And Maggie fainted. "Maggie? Maggie?" Come on, the familiar voice above her was full of concern. "You can't do that, girl. You've got to do something, you know. What should I do, splash you with cold water? Or call a paramedic, huh?" Maggie opened her eyes. The wooden ceiling swayed above her, but immediately returned to stability. Her back was stiff from lying on the bench, and it was hard to breathe. The chain of her pendant seemed to be twisted again under her sweater. Oh, she was squirming, so it was not paralysis that broke her with fear. "Well, what have you achieved, old witch?" I told you. It's no good. That's how it is. Going for the girl." Maggie looked at the speaker and was surprised to find herself somehow transported from the library to Edie's grandfather's house. "You're heavy," he informed her, as if he'd read her mind. "I had to carry it. Well, what was I supposed to do? I couldn't stay there. The library was supposed to be closed, and it would have been awkward, a place for books, silence, science." Edie put his index finger up. "And not for all the fainting and debating." What kind of debriefing? The speech came through a cotton blanket, so Maggie only grasped the last of it. "The old witch of flight. You're sorry, Lexi, for making cruel jokes, but how did you behave, huh? Impossible. Disgraced me, an old man. I mean, I sheltered you." Edie replied and nodded to the side. Maggie now only noticed that besides them there was a third person in the room. That old woman. "Sheesh, sheesh." The old man jumped up to Maggie and took her gently by the shoulder. "You're going to fall again, and I'll have to lift you up again, won't I? You take it easy, dear." "I'm sorry," Maggie sat up gingerly, and she still didn't understand what was happening. No, Grandpa Edie himself was well known to her. A lonely old man, about 100 years retired, he lived quietly, a kind of local hermit. However, it was known that Edie had a son and a grandson in the big city, and they were doing well. They called the old man to them, offered to place him in a comfortable, modern nursing home. But Edie flatly refused and stayed in the village. And somehow, he lived strong, fast, despite all the diagnoses from doctors. He kept a flock of goats with strange, long ears and a few sheep. A local man helped to take care of the livestock. From the milk, Edie brewed amazingly tasty delicacy cheese, which almost all went to the market, and of course the local table. In addition, in his time, grandfather went to the forest. He alone knew their special, generous mushroom and berry places, and also collected herbs for tea, and all this also sold a little bit. The mysterious old woman in black sat on a chair at the side and was looking through something in her hands. Maggie squinted. It was beads of colorful stones. Her favorite beads, the old man said thoughtfully. "I once gave it to her for her birthday. Grandpa Edie, Maggie said timidly. Who's that? Oh, the old man waved his hand, smiled awkwardly, looked at them both in turn, chewed his lip. Well, first of all, I'll tell you what, don't be scared of her. Lexi, she's a harmless character. She's my, let's say, longtime acquaintance here. Really? I didn't invite her to visit in any way, and I wasn't expecting her at all. But she just showed up. Well, as if from under the ground. I already talked to her. Why did you come here? And she, I'm sorry, old man, I didn't see it coming. She rushed to you. Me. Maggie frowned, rubbing the back of her head, where a lump was forming. Don't ask me questions, I'm shocked. Edie waved his hands, and Maggie realized from the look on his face that he was totally confused about that part of the story. Lexi? Edie called quietly to the old woman. Lexi, my dear, kindly, can't we talk? And that, Maggie isn't mad at you for scaring her. I'm really not mad, Maggie added hurriedly. It's just that you just showed up out of the blue. A lost child, said the old woman. She raised her head, gazed with her eyes, opened her mouth to say something, and suddenly relaxed again. Her shoulders slumped. Her head hung down, her fingers slipping, searching through the beads. There, those were her words that started it all. Edie sighed. I wondered what she was up to. He looked at Maggie in a strange, guilty way. She was babbling about some child, but who? You'd never know it. And then, when I brought her to me, and we sat down to talk, the old man scratched his short, bushy beard, which had not had a single dark hair in it for 20 years. Grandpa Edie, Maggie stood up, stretching. She was feeling better. But Grandpa Edie didn't seem to be doing so well. He was very pale. Would you like some tea? You're right, said the landlord. You've been on your feet all morning. I thought to rest. I was coming out of the forest and I saw this one walking along the road. She was walking like that. I could feel that she was very tired. What road? Maggie asked. The one to the bus stop? No, the one that goes through the grove to the former state farm and turns there. Well, it's also the road that the dacha owners often use to get to the community. So I think Edie squinted. Either someone gave her a ride, or she was coming from the district center, and she could have come there by electric train or some other transport. Only as I know from the last one, Lexi didn't live in the city, in this million-strong city, but far away from here. Does she have any relatives? I don't want to say anything offensive, Maggie suggested cautiously. But don't you think she has mental problems? Did you say that in scientific language? Edie grinned. You mean about Lexi being stupid? Yeah, that's a thing. But I've been through something like that. You'd have to try to stay sane after that. Edie was silent again, looking at Maggie strangely again. What happened? Maggie asked, and the next moment she almost shrieked, because the old woman had moved closer, sat down at the table, and reached for a cup of newly brewed tea. She took a sip, nibbling. She looked at the girl attentively, shook her head. How about some jam, Lexi? Edie asked. There's strawberry jam. Come on, said Grandma. I'm a little fuzzy in my head. I'm sorry if I've offended anyone, but only. Oh, all right. Suddenly she waved her hand, and her voice sounded clear, 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 and it seemed that she was in good order mentally. Apparently you don't believe me either. Nobody believes me. And I found you, didn't I? And she jabbed her finger at Maggie again. Don't worry, Lexi, Edie said. Don't worry. It's all yours and we'll figure it out. Let's have some tea for now. And I'll tell Maggie our story first, if you don't mind, okay? He waited for a while. Silence is a sign of agreement, Edie proclaimed, and then he spoke. Talking about his past, mixing it with what Lexi had told him earlier. And he warned Maggie that in order to make sense of it all, he'd have to go back to the distant past first. At that time, Edie had been some young, Zealand 20-something years old. He had such a temper that he couldn't sit in the village. He wanted to go to the city for big dreams, fresh impressions, some grandiose accomplishments. His parents, ordinary laborers who had devoted their whole life to the land, did not quite understand their only son, but they did not try to stop him. A man is looking for his way, so no stepping stones, just wish him luck. Edie entered a construction technical school, but already in the second year he started working with his hands thanks to science from his grandfather, who was a master of wood and taught him how to handle it so that the beauty came out of any piece, even from a small twig. The fame of Eddie's skill spread like a nightingale's song in the spring, and soon he was invited to join a team that was building a summer house for a big man named Alex Grace. And this dacha was not one of those where people go on weekends to plant potatoes and fry kebabs, although theoretically it was possible to do that here too. But first of all, this dacha was planned as a place of almost year-round residence for Alex's wife Judy, and for his son Ben, who, like his mother, suffered from agonizing asthma attacks. And so, as the doctors advised to spend more time outdoors, such attention was paid to the cottage. This work Edie liked Alex paid generously and said simply, "Make it beautiful. I want to make my wife and son happy." And Edie was happy to try. He covered the railings, windowsills, and everything else he could with skillful carvings. But he also did not forget about the future. He treated it with the right compounds, so that neither bugs, nor dampness, nor time were not afraid of wood. Well, in general, so that in the future Alex's grandchildren and great-grandchildren could enjoy the dacha. The work was going fast, and as they say, with a song. And also the further, the more Edie wanted to sing, not just for fun, but for one particular person. Her name was Lexi, and she was a personal assistant and babysitter to little Ben. The statuesque blonde Lexi was so good, but also strikingly silent and sad. Eddie, however, who had never failed in life, decided that he would get her attention. "Don't try," Lexi said one day when he brought her the first strawberry from a nearby forest. "You're a good guy, but we'll never be together." "Why not?" Edie was taken aback. There was something about Lexi's tone that he didn't like. Oh, he didn't like it. "I'm a curse," she replied. "What?" Edie was taken aback. "What kind of prejudice and superstition is that? It's not Soviet, you know." "I'm cursed," Lexi repeated stubbornly. "My grandfather, a fist, drove away a worker. She was in a heavy situation. She starved to death. That's when my family was cursed. Women can't bear children, and some are barren. I am barren, maybe." She looked adoringly at Ben, who was playing in a sandbox under a red mushroom hat canopy. "Since I won't have children of my own, I can at least be a babysitter for this family." Later, Edie repeatedly told himself that, no, he didn't believe in the curse. He wasn't stupid, and it wasn't because he'd given up on Lexi because she couldn't have kids. He decided that they just couldn't be together. They wouldn't get along in the end. However, Edie decided they could and should be friends. Lexi didn't mind that at all, by the way. The work on the cottage dragged on until the late fall. Edie, back home, did not miss Lexi and soon got married. His chosen one was the daughter of the neighbors, and as it turned out, parents from both sides had long ago agreed that it would be good to marry the children. However, the joys of young family life did not prevent Edie from remembering Lexi, and they corresponded. True, Edie's wife, when she learned about this friendship, at first she was jealous, of course, what kind of friends her beloved husband could have. But in time she realized that Lexi was not dangerous. Time flew by. Sometimes Edie, his wife Sophia, and Lexi even met and had a good time together. And it also turned out that Lexi could give 1,000 valuable tips to a young mom and help to get scarce and even imported things for the baby. Edie had a son. Time flew on. Lexi, as she once said, never married, devoting herself to taking care of Ben. And even as he grew older, well, she somehow stayed in the family. Who else would want me? That's how Lexi explained her situation. And when my master Ben gets married, when he has kids, I'll be useful. Yes, Lexi called Ben that, and even more so, her father, and repeated that the meaning of her life was in faithful service to these people. Edie felt sorry for her, because he reasoned that it was a very good thing when a person was faithful, when they were willing to help. That it's good when a person melds his or her soul with loved ones, and it doesn't matter whether they are relatives by blood or by mutual decision. But at the same time, oh, how unkind, dangerous it is to dissolve into the lives of other people. It's not long to lose yourself. In the meantime, life went on as usual, and one day Lexi sent a happy message. Ben decided to get married, but the choice of the chosen one worried Lexi. And the thing was this, it was the 90s and a lot, oh how much, had changed. Alex Grace had transformed from the director of a large department store into a successful businessman and was preparing a great future for his son. And Ben, young and rebellious, decided to fall in love with a girl from a dysfunctional family. His father resented him, saying, "How could it be so? There are girls from good families. Business partners have already seen several brides choose anyone. Everyone will go, will throw their arms around you." But Ben did not yield to his father's stubbornness and said firmly that he would marry Peggy, and then he could do whatever he wanted. "I don't care if they disinherit him. I don't care if they kick him out of the house." But Alex Grace was not going to go to such extreme measures. He waved his hand and accepted his daughter-in-law, and even as Lexi reported, he treated her well. But then, first it became clear that Ben had grown cold to his young wife over time and started looking at other women. And secondly, it turned out that Alex had an insidious, cruel plan. It was that he had found out something about Peggy's past. It turned out that she was moonlighting in a very ancient, shameless profession. And Alex, when he found out about it, at first he was horrified. And then he realized that the folk wisdom that there was no happiness, but misfortune helped. Lexi led an isolated life under her masters, and only Edie in her numerous letters could pour out her thoughts and worries. And now letters flew to him, in which she told about everything that was happening in the family. Alex gave an order to his lawyers: prepare whatever tricky moves you want. And as soon as the heir is born, it should be arranged so that Peggy would be thrown out of Grace's family. Divorce, termination of parental rights, and bonus, she could be committed to a mental institution. Lexi was torn about what to do. On the one hand, she had sworn to herself to be loyal to the family of her masters, and on the other hand, she felt so sorry for Peggy. She was basically a good girl. And as for the call girl thing, yes, it had happened. But Peggy only did it because her brother needed expensive treatment. She wanted to take him abroad for surgery. The brother, by the way, died anyway. Edie was in shock and didn't know what to say to his friend. He was afraid to advise anything. After all, he had nothing to do with it. So he only asked Lexi to be careful. And so Lexi made a decision. She told Peggy everything, and together they decided that she should run away before the birth. Far away to relatives very far away. They quietly packed their things, a little cash. Peggy took one of the family cars and one day secretly left the mansion. And that's when the worst happened. Peggy was speeding down the highway. It was raining. She'd calculated everything. She was still 2 weeks away from giving birth. She had to make it. But she must have been stressed. She felt bad. And then, on the side of the road, Peggy suddenly noticed a frail figure. And she slowed down because it was a girl, just like her, with a big belly. She introduced herself as Helen and said that she was in trouble. Her husband, Pete, wanted to drive her to town, but the car had stalled halfway there. And it was very necessary to go to town. Just today she could see a very good doctor. There he is. Ellen waved in the direction, where by the roadside stood a Ziguli, under the hood of which her husband was digging. He, by the way, noticing that the car was ready to pick up his unlucky passenger, came closer and looked inside the cabin. He nodded approvingly. "It's good that you're a woman," he said. "I wouldn't let Ellen go with a strange man." "So maybe I could give you a ride, too?" Peggy asked. "How am I going to leave the car?" Freddie shrugged his shoulders. "It doesn't seem to be a very big breakdown. I'll get it fixed soon and come and pick up my wife from the clinic." Peggy shrugged. Well, that was a sensible decision. She thought that she would drive Helen to the clinic, and then she would go on her own away from the city, farther and farther away. Then she would take the train. She would go to the Far East, where her relatives lived. Helene hugged her husband tightly, kissed him goodbye, sat down on the front passenger seat, and off we went. Oh, road work. Helene was upset. "Do you know if there is a way around here?" "Yes, there is," nodded Peggy. "There are 2 roads. But the shorter one is often used by big trucks." "Well, maybe we should take the longer one," Ellen said uncertainly. "Can we make it to 4, do you think?" "We will." Peggy nodded. Meanwhile, the rain was getting heavier. It was late fall, and the first snow was falling from the low, slate-black clouds. This second road was really freer. It was not used much at all. Part of it ran through the woods. And then suddenly Peggy was twisted with pain. "What's the matter with you?" Ellen exclaimed. "Is it the baby?" I don't know, whispered Peggy. Oh, Mommy, it's starting, I think. And apparently at this moment it would be necessary to stop the car. But Peggy did not have time to do it. And also the road was slippery from the rain. And suddenly everything turned upside down, and literally the car shook, drove, and then it flew down the road into the ravine. How much time passed then? How many tens of minutes passed in an agonizing pain and fear-filled nightmare? They were found. Help had arrived. Alex Grace was no fool and quickly realized that his sister-in-law would not have left so easily on some routine errand of her own, so early in the morning, without alerting anyone in the family. And it came out that if it hadn't been for the pursuit of the father-in-law, Peggy would not have been saved, nor her traveling companion, nor the baby, one of the two babies born. Yes, the baby was born there, guided into this world only by the love of her mother, who, barely hanging on the verge of fainting after the disaster, but managed to muster the strength to give her life. But the second child that Peggy had carried under her heart just a few hours ago did not survive. Alex Grace, when he realized this, was just in shock. He felt as if he had lost his heart. How could it be? His granddaughter, a tiny baby girl, his son's daughter. It was impossible. It was wrong. It shouldn't have happened in his personal world, where money and power allowed him to get everything he once dreamed of. And suddenly, willfully, he lost his granddaughter. "We are doing everything we can," said the doctor of a very expensive private clinic, to which the injured women were taken, in a trembling voice. "But I'm afraid that your daughter-in-law—" "I don't give a damn about her." Alex Grace roared and slammed his fist into the wall with all his might, knocking down the expensive Venetian plaster that lined the visitor's lobby, shattering his knuckles. "Fool," he growled. "Stupid bitch. Let her die for all I care. I lost my granddaughter because of her. I don't care what happens to her." But the doctors, of course, were fighting for Peggy's life because despite the anger, the hatred that was eating away at his soul like rusting metal, Mr. Grace had paid the clinic generously to do what they could for Peggy, and for her traveling companion and the baby she'd given birth to. Not 24 hours after that terrible car accident, Peggy passed away. Faithful Lexi was by her side to the last, and so was Ben. True, already at the end Peggy said she wanted to talk privately with Lexi. As for Peggy's parents, they were far away at that time. They had gone on a vacation on a trip and physically couldn't get there in time. Andy couldn't bring himself to enter the room. Not to his sister-in-law, not to that other young woman. He stood at the door of Ellen's room and frowned, pondering. Was this what fate had ordained? If Peggy hadn't picked up a hitchhiker, maybe she wouldn't have gotten into the accident either. Maybe. "Can I give her something from you?" the nurse asked timidly. No, Andy shook his head. "Keep her here as long as she needs for her health, and then, no, let her get the hell out of here with her offspring. I have nothing to do with this. Not anymore." Lexi had told Edie in one of her last letters how it all went down about Peggy trying to run away, about the accident, about how she had lost the baby and died soon after. These last letters of Lexi's were riddled with bitter guilt. The faithful maid of Grace's family felt guilty. She thought now that she should have thought of some other way to help Peggy instead of this running away. Then, everything would be okay. And then, Lexi showed up on Edie's doorstep, and he didn't recognize her at first. Clad in black, it was as if her face had aged 10 years. Looking away and stammering, confused in her own speech, Lexi told him that she couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't stay in the family she had spent so many years in, because she hadn't kept Peggy and her child safe. She's let everyone down. "It's not your fault," Edie said firmly. "If my father-in-law hadn't been up to it, why would Paula have run away in the first place? He's the one, the bastard." "I don't care. I'm leaving," Lexi sighed. "And where are you going?" Edie asked, confused. "I have relatives. They live far away," Lexi mumbled. "They have a cabin in the taiga. They'll take me in there. And you. I'm sorry, Eddie, but I won't write letters often anymore. Forgive me. Forgive me for everything." Well, Edie felt more embarrassed than ever before in his life. "You're certainly not guilty of anything in front of me." His wife also showed sympathy, She tried to convince Lexi not to make hasty decisions, advised her to find a psychologist. But she went away after a couple of days. When the old man was silent, Maggie sighed convulsively and shuddered as if a bee had stung her, blinked often. What a horrible, sad story. But there was something in it that was particularly important to her personally. That fellow traveler. Her name was Helene, she whispered. No, I was wrong, wasn't I? But Lexi told her. She had blonde hair. And also, it happened in September? The baby was born in the fall month. The old woman struggled to say the exact date. But it's my birthday. Maggie gasped and put her palm over her mouth. But Mama, she never told me about it. I only knew I was born prematurely. So that's why she doesn't like to remember that time so much. Edie reached out and closed his fingers around her wrist, almost painfully. So this isn't the end of the story. How? Why? What else do I need to know? Maggie exhaled heavily. It was so strange. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice over which a thin, ephemeral, almost bridge had been thrown. And she had to walk across it, but almost certainly risked falling off. But she had to keep moving forward. Lexi. We hadn't seen each other in years. Letters. Well, she sent a card or two a year. Happy New Year and my birthday, Edie said. So usually, politely, nothing personal. And then, lo and behold, today she came. She showed up in person, after all these years. Said she couldn't keep quiet anymore. She said that she lied to me. She lied to everyone. But now she can't keep quiet anymore. And what was the lie about? Maggie asked in a colorless voice, turning her gaze to the old woman. She was sitting with her fingers interlocked and looking straight into the girl's eyes. Lexi. Edie exclaimed, standing up abruptly from the table. Well, what are you doing, huh? That's right, I've always been your friend and still am. Only. That's it. I can't take it anymore. Go on, you tell me. And I. He waved his hand. I can't hear it a second time. Excuse me, I'll just sit on the porch, okay? And with these words, the old man ran out of the house. The antique wall clock ticked quietly. Somewhere inside Maggie was squirming with an irresistible urge to follow Edie's example and run away. Just for good. It was as if her intuition was screaming at her, now you don't need to know what that old woman in black is going to say. And her mind was telling her that it would be nonsense, just nonsense, because, well, look, that old woman, she's crazy, you can tell. But only. On some other unknowable deep level, Maggie realized that everything she was about to hear would be the truth. And so the old woman in black spoke. Then, holding the fading Peggy's hand, Lexi was unwittingly privy to her secret. It turned out that before help arrived, Peggy had made a decision. Not an easy one, but she thought the right one for her. The thing was that even before the accident, while driving and chatting as if about nothing with a fellow traveler, Peggy was suddenly pierced by a pang of white envy. She thought that this young woman will surely become a wonderful mother. And her husband seemed to be a good man. Ellen's baby was stillborn. Peggy's baby was barely audible, but the girl was alive. And then, in a few moments, when the sound of cars in the distance, it was help on its way, Peggy made up her mind. Take my daughter, she whispered, holding out her baby girl to Ellen. Ellen's eyes widened. She had not yet recovered from the shock. Her mind had not yet fully internalized the terrible truth about the loss of her baby. But she listened and heard. Peggy, gasping for breath, only by force of will to keep consciousness, said that her father-in-law, a terrible, cruel man. That the child she gave birth to would not be loved, that it would be brought up by nannies, and then Ben would probably remarry, and perhaps that woman would become a cruel stepmother to the child, not a mother. You're good, whispered Peggy, coughing harshly. Please take her. Let her be your daughter. No one will notice. The switch. Raise her as your own. She is your own, already. The heart-wrenching pain of losing her child was mixed in Ellen's mind with sympathy for this casual acquaintance. But decisive was the moment when the girl slipped into her arms from the weakening arms of her true mother. Very weak, so small. She opened her eyes so transparent, like shards of winter sky, and weakly squeaked. And then Helene cried and nodded. What's her name? She asked. What should I call her? Peggy breathed out and fainted. The next thing they knew, help was rushing around the machine. People talking about how to open the doors safely and get the victims out. But Peggy didn't want to, couldn't go to the other side without revealing this truth to the one person she trusted most in the world, Lexi. She said there had to be someone to know, just in case this knowledge might come in handy for Maggie one day. But she made Lexi swear not to tell anyone unless it was absolutely necessary. And Lexi, oh, how hard it was for her. Bound by that vow and at the same time driven by obligations to the family she had served all her life, she just didn't know what to think, what to do. And so she decided to go away altogether. It seemed to her that it would bring peace to her heart. It would save her from agonizing thoughts about whether she was right to keep this secret. And the years flew by. Lexi kept her word. And then, she herself explained it this way: bad dreams began to visit her lately. And it seemed that the time was coming when the truth would be revealed. Lexi had little to no contact with Grace's family, so barely knew about what was going on with them. But now, just 3 months ago, news came that confirmed her strange dreams and premonitions. It was time to act. Alex Grace had long since passed away. His son, Ben, had been married twice more, and each union ended in a high-profile scandal infidelity on the part of the wives. And Ben also had health problems. Not quite bad, but doctors recommended caution. And the family lawyer directly said that with such a heart it is better to make a will in advance. But to whom? There were no heirs. And then Ben decided that for the simplicity of the matter, he would transfer his property, the lion's share of it, including controlling stakes in several companies, to one person. His name was Taylor, and he had been his faithful assistant for over 5 years. Ben planned to spend the rest on charity. That's it, girl Lexi finished her story with a sigh. Maggie sat there, not feeling herself and barely aware of herself in space and reality at all. There were too many thoughts, and at the same time it seemed that in the head, in the heart, a strange emptiness settled. Maggie, are you all right? Edie, who had already returned to the house at the end of the story, called her gently. I told her to take her time, but she was in a hurry. Probably because she had been looking for you and Ellen's daughter for a long time. She was afraid she wouldn't find you, so she got nervous and hurried. I'm sorry? Did you dump it quickly? The girl replied in a colorless voice and looked at Edie in such a way that he flinched. You. Maggie struggled to speak, her hysteria choking her. She stood up. She stretched out her hand and jabbed her finger at the old woman, who, as if her battery had run out, the battery she had used up on her story had sunk back into herself and was quietly fiddling with her beads. You've been my whole life. My mother. I'm not her kin, am I? No, it's not true. I don't believe it. I didn't believe it either, Edie sighed. Only Lexi doesn't have a habit of lying, and she's crazy, Maggie shouted. No, I don't believe it. None of this is true. Except that with each spouted denial, there was a growing, hard realization inside her, some instinctual realization that this could all be true. Without proof. It's just the way it is. It's a fact. Like the fact that the sun shines during the day except on a polar night. Maggie, I'm sorry, I wouldn't even go near you with all this. Would you believe it? Edie pounded his chest with his gaunt fist. But she did, didn't she? Didn't she run? Well, what else was there to do, huh? You're a fool, I know. I lied, not thinking that you work in our library. No, why? Why did she tell me all this? The realization of a new meaning hit me like a storm. Aha, Maggie exclaimed. What does she think I want? An inheritance? That I need money? Well, Edie coughed. Lexi told me that she was old, that she was afraid she'd die with her. And about the money, yeah, what's the big deal, Maggie, huh? Money means something too since you're born with it. Grace, he's a rich man. I had a mom and dad, real ones, my own. I don't want no other. Maggie inhaled convulsively, biting her lip painfully. And I don't want money, and I know I don't want to hear any more. And she rushed out of the house. The hay door slammed, then the front door, then the wicket door a moment later. Edie shook his head. What are we going to do? Lexi, honey, huh? Where am I supposed to put you? Maybe you could whisper an address, the phone number of your relatives, so they could take you away. But the old woman answered nothing. Smiling, she was looking through the beads and thinking about her own. ... A persistent knock on the door woke Maggie. The girl craned her neck and grimaced as she lay down on the sofa for a minute and fell asleep until morning. Or rather, until the day the clock showed a quarter to an hour. I had never slept so long. My nose was deaf, I'd been crying, and my eyes were swollen. "Maggie, are you home?" Vivian's insistent voice could be heard outside the window now, and Maggie, pulling open the tulle curtains, hurried to open it. "Why haven't you gone to work?" Vivian broke off, perceiving by the look on her young friend's face that she was not well. "What's wrong?" asked the logical question. Maggie shrugged and sniffed noisily, urgently needed to go to the bathroom. "I'll be right there." "Yeah," Vivian snorted. "Unlock the door and we'll deal with this together." Shrugging again, Maggie let her in. Somehow I felt so indifferent to everything. Who insulted her? Was Kolka joking again? "Oh, he'll fly into the burdocks, I'll give him a kicking." Vivian grumbled, following Maggie's footsteps. "Come on, tell me what happened. Or is it personal?" "Personal." Maggie gurgled from under the cold running water. "I'm fine, really. It's just tired." Vivian was about to say that she knew her too well to believe her, but there was another knock at the door. "Maggie, help me." "Trouble." Edie's voice was ringing with alarm. "Okay," Vivian squinted and went to open the door. What kind of day is this? What other surprises would it hold? "Lexi's missing." Edie hooted like a frightened owl. "Kidnapped." "Okay," Vivian said. "Who is Lexi, and since when do people get kidnapped in New York? Or did you get a new goat and call her that? Well, I don't envy the one who's been trespassing on your livestock." Maggie was very angry, hurt, shocked at what she'd been told. But first of all, it wasn't Edie's fault he hadn't started it. And secondly, the negativity receded when she realized that the defenseless, and not quite in herself, old woman was in trouble. Even if it is not clear yet in what kind of trouble. Who kidnapped her? What happened? Maggie wiped her face with a towel, sat Edie on a stool, and handed the old man a cup of water. "I don't know. He came. In a black car," he said. "Oh, I can't, my heart." "Vivian, please give me the first aid kit." "In the closet, top shelf on the left," Maggie asked. "Who is Lexi, and what's going on here?" she asked, handing over what she needed. Edie, having drunk the healing drops, finally got his breath back and started talking. He hadn't managed to ask Lexi about her family that evening and decided to postpone it for the morning. In the morning, as was his custom, he thought he would have breakfast outdoors. He took Lexi out too, sat her at the table, poured tea. I went to get some eggs, and as soon as I came out with the frying pan, I saw this guy in black putting her in a black car. She was waving her hands, squeaking something, and he grabbed her and shoved her inside. Well, I went to him. I dropped the rag and oven mitt. I swung the frying pan at him, saying, "Don't touch the old woman." And he said, "Stay out of it. Old man, it's none of your business. I'll take care of her," like Taylor said, and that was it. Eddie looked down at his trembling hands. The frying pan burns on the fingers of his right hand. And then there's Tommy. What's the neighbor's dog got to do with it? Vanessa rounded her eyes. And I repeat, who is Lexi? Tommy ate the eggs, Edie explained grimly. Maggie, having quickly found the ointment for burns in the medicine cabinet, was already putting a bandage on the old man's arm. I wish Lexi had had a chance to try my scrambled eggs. Delicious, with red onions and paprika. By the way, I didn't eat breakfast today. I didn't even drink coffee, Vivian said thoughtfully, more to herself. I thought I'd go on a diet. I've deprived myself of the gastronomic joy of life for nothing. With this kind of business, with you guys, you're going to miss lunch. Lexi, this is Edie's old friend. A good friend, Maggie said. She showed up in the village yesterday and then she found me. Vivian, don't just stand there, okay? There, make yourself some tea. I've got some stuffed cabbage left over from last night's lunch. You take it and eat it. Grandpa Edie, you calm down. No. Okay. Let's think together. Maybe Lexi's relatives have come for her? Edie hummed, chewed his lips, stared at the ceiling for a moment, as if the answers could be spelled out there. No, she'd told them she'd gone to a sanitarium. She could lie when she had to. But, oh, I remember. Edie exclaimed so loudly that Vivian, who had actually gone for the stuffed cabbage, almost dropped the dish. Taylor. That's Ben's heir. But how did he? Why would he do that? I guess no one will ever explain to me what's going on here, Vivian complained sadly. Maggie sighed. If she'd hoped to get away from everything tonight, to take a break, she'd been wrong. Let's get to the table, she invited Edie. You haven't had breakfast either. Let's talk over breakfast, shall we? And I'll tell it like it is, she smiled sadly at Vivian. Vivian listened to the whole story with great attention, but that did not prevent her from cleaning her plate as diligently as before and taking a refill. Oh, Maggie. The older friend was almost crying herself. To know such a thing. How could it be? Is everyone sure? Unless Lexi is suffering from a mental breakdown, it's for sure, Maggie nodded. But that doesn't change anything for me. I only have one mom. And there's only one father. And I don't want anything. I'm not going to go and fight for the inheritance. That's right, Vivian nodded. But still, your father. Ben, he's your own father. By blood. And I think it's unfair and cruel to stay here and not say anything. Supporting Lexi's lie, even if it was originally, like, for good. Although, Vivian slapped her palm on the table indignantly. We can't say for sure how things would have been if you'd stayed with Grace's family, can we? Maybe Grandpa would have loved his granddaughter and Ben would have been a wonderful father. So, I guess it's just a matter of dealing with it all. And help Lexi out, of course. And how do we do that? Maggie waved her hands. I can't. You can. Vivian interrupted her. Yes, you can and you should. Time off from work now. It's a family emergency. I'll talk to our superintendent right away. And by the way, I'll go with you. I'm supposed to start my vacation tomorrow. So, as much as possible, while everything is going well? What about me? Grandpa Edie asked resentfully. Lexi is my friend. No one's arguing that, Vivian nodded. But I think that 3 of us going to the city for her is too much. And then, no offense, but your age. And goats. You refuse to go to the hospital because you have no one to leave the animals on. So I'm going to go with Maggie and me. Just tell us everything you know again, okay? The addresses, where to find Taylor. I think we can find them on the internet. Vivian said with an important smile, pulling out a brand new smartphone in a glamorous pink case and opening a browser. Maggie felt like a little girl who had been swept up by a whirlwind, lifted into the sky, and was being dragged and carried somewhere. Events were moving so fast. 1, to write a statement to the head of the library. 2, to collect a minimum of things in a travel bag. 3, once again, the 3 of us discussed a plan of action. 4, turn off all appliances in the house, lock the door and windows. 5, she and Vivian are already on the bus to the city. Maggie fussed and almost ran, but Vivian grabbed her arm just in time. What are you doing? Panic attack, she asked her friend seriously. Come on, breathe. Inhale and exhale, calmly inhale and exhale. No, Maggie squeaked, lowering her head. She had felt it from the very beginning, since they had come to town, the curious, sympathetic, and even unpleasant looks of the people around her. But in the village, she had gotten so used to the general bad attitude that somehow she didn't pay attention. But now, when they were standing in front of a shining tower of glass and concrete, a business center, many floors of which were occupied by the office of the corporation owned by Mr. Gray's, she suddenly realized furiously, piercingly, she has such a thing with her face. A panicked urge to cancel the whole thing. Or at least postpone. I should have worn makeup, Maggie sniffed. It would have been less noticeable. You're allergic to makeup, remember? Vivian said sternly. Oh, well, what kind of a fool are you? Nobody's looking at you. That's not true. Everyone does. Because people have eyes. So they look around. And if someone thinks something bad, Well, then he's crazy. And you're beautiful and smart. Do you really think that your father will evaluate you like at the Miss World Beauty contest instead of just being happy that his daughter is alive? Only if your daughter is suddenly ugly, Maggie whispered. Maybe we'll do better tomorrow. Aha. Vivian grinned. We've already spent so much on a room for tomorrow that it's scary. No way. And besides, we're here for Lexi too. Why would they want her? Don't be so shy. Come on, cheer up, keep your head up, don't slouch and smile. Let's go. And Vivian, holding Maggie's hand tightly, headed for the sparkling, clear, clean, revolving door to the business center. The girl at the reception desk downstairs was asked what floor, and passed into the elevator, which lifted swiftly and easily. The doors opened. Are you signed in? Another girl at the reception desk, but now at the office of Gray's firm, asked a question while looking at the computer. No, Vivian answered importantly. We're here to see Taylor, but we have a very important case. I'm sorry, but Taylor only sees appointments or top-level employees of the company, she chirped with stoic politeness. Vivian was not used to giving up. Tell him we're here. Tell him we're here for Lexi. He'll know what we're talking about. The girl frowned, obviously wondering if it was time to call security, poked her finger at the computer. Then she sighed and nodded reluctantly. No, look at this, Vivian hissed to a subdued, embarrassed Maggie. They didn't offer a seat, no tea or coffee. Also, what's it called? Corporation, all kinds of elite society. Hey, this place clearly needs to work with personnel. The girl returned a minute later, surprised and embarrassed. I apologize. Taylor will see you in her office. She made a gesture with her hand. Straight down the hall, then left. This was the first time this had ever happened to Maggie. She entered the office with the feeling that she and Vivian were going to have a difficult conversation. They needed to find out why Lexi had been taken away so unceremoniously, so rudely, and worst of all, they needed to make a statement. And Maggie still had serious doubts about the necessity of the latter. But when she entered the office, it was as if all these problems, as if they melted into thin air, because she suddenly drowned in the eyes of the man across the hall. It must have lasted a few moments in reality, but for her it lasted many times longer. Taylor turned out to be a stately brunette of 35, with correct, as if chiseled by an ancient Greek master, and in his eyes. They were the deep color of a stormy sea, in which the calm shades of indigo and the doldrums had not yet faded. The man was dressed in a dark blue suit to match the color of his eyes, and an off-white shirt, but he wore no tie. Maggie? He addressed her in a strong, velvety voice, but Maggie was numb and only nodded. Taylor? Vivian, who had almost pushed her friend behind her back as if Taylor would attack and bite her, answered for her. Thank you for taking a moment for us. Do you have any idea why we're here? Partly, perhaps, he answered evasively, and his gaze shifted from Maggie to Vivian for the first time. Clinging, piercing, sensitive, but without a shadow of aggression. I'm sorry we're getting to know each other under these circumstances. When you kidnapped a man, Maggie blurted out, even though she didn't mean to be rude. Edie's grandpa's heart nearly gave out. Lexi is the closest thing to him since his dead wife. I apologize, he frowned, but had the tiniest bit of a snide smile playing on his lips. Edie, is this the old man we found Lexi with? I'm afraid my man acted somewhat rudely. I apologize, but believe me, the rush was only out of concern for Lexi's mental state. You see, she showed up so suddenly, and then she disappeared. Maggie and Vivian looked at each other. Eddie hadn't mentioned that Lexi had apparently talked to Gorney or anyone else in his entourage before him. Have a seat, please, Taylor gestured invitingly to the sheet chairs across from his desk. Vivian plumped herself into one. Coffee, tea? Suggested the landlord. No, we just want to talk, replied Vivian, sending her younger friend a glance. Don't say anything yet. So, I think I should start by clarifying things a bit. Taylor waved his hand in the air. The situation and explain what I know. Yes, please, Maggie said, noting to herself that in all this time, which was the odd thing, she hadn't noticed anything in Taylor's gaze that somehow suggested that he'd noticed her stain on his face. And that was weird, because people noticed She was used to it. And just this lack of specific attention had had a strange effect on Maggie. It was as if 1,000 needles had touched her weightlessly and at the same time like a butterfly's wing. Taylor spoke. It turned out that Lexi, though she had left the Grays family, wanting to cut all ties, had not been forgotten over the years. Andy and then Ben regularly sent her holiday gifts, scarce things, delicacies, and money. They'd called to see if she needed anything, if there was anything they could do to help the people she was now living with. But Lexi stubbornly refused. And then, as time went on, it became clear that something was wrong with her. Her distant family confirmed her suspicions. Lexi was slowly starting to go out of her mind, just like that. But what could Ben do about it? She was one of the quiet crazies, spent almost all her time quietly in the house or in the yard. And that's why no one had ever put her in any clinic for treatment. And then just the other day it happened. It was incomprehensible how Lexi in her condition made it on her own from so far away. But she did. And she went to her old address, the Grays mansion. Ben was happy to see his now very old babysitter, but he was shocked at what she had told him. He didn't want to believe a word of it, but he did. Ben Grays had enough opportunity to start looking for information at once. He had learned that the daughter of the fellow traveler lived in the village, and Ben was going to come and talk to Maggie about everything, and not just talk. He wanted to ask for your consent to a genetic examination, Taylor said, and looked guilty. You do realize that going on the word of someone who's not quite right in the head. Well, confirming that story could have some serious repercussions. Aha, Vivian said, and added without delicacy. We agree to that. And then you will realize that Maggie can claim her father's property, not you. Vivian, Maggie exclaimed, her eyes flushing with shame. I'm sorry, she turned to Taylor. I wasn't thinking about the money at all. Because she's a silly, naive girl, sometimes in places. Vivian intervened again. An orphan. Anyone can and does take offense, by the way. Who's hurting you? Taylor asked sternly, and looked at Maggie so hard that she felt her ears burn and wanted to fall through the ground. No one. I'm fine. Vivian, enough, please. After Mother, that's when Mother died. I'm the only one she has, and the others. Vivian waved her hand. In general, I see. Expertise. And when, may I say, should the girl meet her father? Or you won't let her meet the father without your expertise? Let's make something clear. Taylor added metal to his voice. And Maggie was even grateful to him for it, because she herself couldn't calm down her friend, who in her understandable, in general, protective aspirations, went completely apart. Since you yourself appeared here, the plans of course change, and I'm ready to inform Ben about your visit right away. As for Lexi, she's gone. I mean, she said she wanted to take a walk down a street she knew, and naturally. You have to admit we couldn't lock her up, could we? Especially since she seemed to be quite adequate at the moment. It took a while to find her. Ben was worried sick. I sent a man to bring Lexi back when the detective said where she could be, supposedly. And again, I apologize for the rude behavior of my staff. It won't happen again. So, sighing, Taylor drummed his fingers on the armrests of his massive executive chair. May I continue? And he continued. And Vivian, much to Maggie's relief, remained silent for the time being. Taylor said that Lexi was now at Ben's mansion, that he had a private and very good psychiatrist for her, who would determine what her condition was at the moment, and whether Lexi should not, for her own good, be sent to a private clinic for a while. And then Taylor said that business matters, they could wait, but the fact that Maggie was here. I'd like to report you to Ben. What, right now? Maggie squeaked. Yes, Taylor nodded. Wait a minute. Vivian spoke again. I mean, how does that work? You want my Maggie to come across to this, Ben? IES ... who, excuse me, suspicious and maybe not a daughter. And then he'll look at the test results. No, you let me talk. The woman waved her hand firmly at Maggie's attempt to stop her. I've changed my mind. There's no need to rush this meeting. We'd better do this. How fast are these tests done? Basically, you can get the results in a day, Taylor said after a moment's thought. So we'll wait a day, see you later. We found a place to stay here. And then, when everything is confirmed. If it's confirmed, I'll ask you to consider it, Taylor said, squinting his eyes. Not to be insulting, but I think you should realize that. Aha, Vivian nodded. We do. There are crooks, that's the way life is. So we wait. But then she got up to leave, and squinted her eyes as she did so, as well as Taylor. We'll be doing business with all the rights, won't we? No doubt, Taylor replied with a polite smile. Finally, they said their goodbyes and left. And what a long day it seemed to Maggie, and the next one was even longer. Vivian, as if sensing her condition, didn't talk about serious matters and instead talked about everything. She took Maggie out for a walk in the park. The weather was wonderful. And of course they called Edie's grandfather and reassured him that Lexi was fine. And then, pack up. Vivian told Maggie after she finished talking to Taylor, he's going to pick us up and we're going to meet your father. So, feeling weak in her knees, Maggie sat down on the edge of the bed in the room. The results of the genetic test. They confirmed that I'm his daughter? Yes, said Vivian. Good, Maggie nodded. I'll be right back. Just for a minute. And she went into the bathroom. Vivian could hear what was going on in there. Maggie was crying, but she didn't disturb her, realizing that it was natural and in a way even normal. After all, Maggie had just received confirmation that her beloved mommy and loving father, it turned out, were not her own in the very same sense. She, of course, it was clear she wouldn't have changed her attitude towards them for the worse. Still, it was quite a shock. Half an hour or so passed and Maggie came out. Washed, not shivering. You could feel the man pulling himself together. I'm ready, she said. They were silent on the road, and everyone, it was clear, was thinking about their own things. Maggie barely noticed that the house she had driven into was a whole suburban mansion surrounded by a gorgeous garden. Taylor was in the driver's seat and gallantly opened the doors in front of the women. Vivian only snickered at that. Maggie absent-mindedly accepted the offered hand, climbed the stairs, entered the marble lobby, which in terms of floor space would be a modest one-bedroom. Maggie froze, because here they were met by a man. He looked even older than his mature years, but in him, though he stood motionless, there was a hidden strength and a need to live impetuously. He gave the impression of a master of life, but right now, he was confused. I am, he said. I guess I should have come myself. Or how? I don't know, he nervously ran his hand over his gray and balding head. I feel like, this is a dream. But you're real, aren't you? He stammered, as if the next word was stuck in his throat. Yes, Maggie answered. It's not a dream. And neither am I. I confess I don't know what to do, what to say, how to act right now. He nodded and sighed. Maggie smiled with the corners of her lips. But I do. Vivian broke the languidly nervous atmosphere as if a glass cup had been shattered with a clinking sound. It's customary for guests to be invited to sit down, to have tea. That's right, Ben grinned, coming to his senses. Of course, let's go into the parlor. In 5 minutes, the maid brought a tray of tea, but the table with all sorts of snacks, from canapes to miniature cakes, was already set. And the conversation flowed. Maggie thought she was dreaming after all. Because, how could that be possible? In fact, when she realized that she could not slip out of this story and back into the usual course of her life, she was expecting some obstacles. And later Vivian told her that she was expecting bad things too. Like the fact that they would be told that Lexi had lost her mind and been put in a madhouse. Or that Taylor and Ben would refuse to believe the story and say it was a blatant lie to get the money and just kick them out the door. And I couldn't even believe. I just couldn't believe it could be that simple in life. Simple? Ben asked and looked sadly, thoughtfully, when Maggie, in one of the next conversations, one of the next days, revealed her thoughts like that. Isn't it just? On the contrary, it's all. It's too complicated, but. And why should it be even more complicated now? Why? Well, Maggie shrugged her shoulders. It's just that it's kind of hard for me to get used to having a father. Again. Oh, I didn't mean to say. You didn't say anything like that, Ben smiled. And know that I don't want to try to replace the father you had, move him, No, I realize that you grew up with other people. You'll never be little, but I still want you to be my daughter, do you understand? Yes, Maggie nodded. And you? Don't be mad. Lexi, it's because of her. I'm not going to lie, Ben glared at her. Angry was a mild word for it. But I didn't touch her, of course. A woman, and an old woman at that. And besides, it's been so long. I think she's already doubting the decision she made back then. Oh, I'm afraid it hit Lexi hard. It's a lot to carry around for years. A couple days later, by the way, Maggie moved into Ben's house. He said he couldn't let his daughter live in a hotel when she had her own house. Vivian, by the way, was invited too because Maggie said she was her best friend. You're it, she admonished Maggie. Don't be shy. If life gives it to you, if your father turned out to be like that, then take the best. You have the right, after all. The point was that Ben had once suggested that Maggie go shopping. Not that he criticized the way his daughter was dressed, but he said he wanted to make up for all the years he'd missed out on presents. So he gave Maggie one of his cards, with which she could buy whatever she wanted. I don't really need anything, Maggie said. And Maggie was also very touched that her father had never once said anything about her spot on her face, as if she were perfectly all right, and she had been afraid of that he wouldn't want an ugly daughter. And naturally, these days it was necessary to talk business too. Ben said that now Maggie just had to move to town, and Vivian was on his side. What if I don't want to? It was the first time Maggie had ever been so openly indignant. Maybe I like living in my mother's old house. It's cozy. Maybe I like working in the library. Maybe I want to stay in the village. I wouldn't force you, or even persuade you very much, Ben smiled, taking her hand gently. All I'm saying is that now, your life could change a lot, and I ask you to think carefully about these new possibilities. Another bad assumption did not come true. Taylor, as it turned out, was not at all furious that he was not the only one who would get the firm. However, Maggie was particularly adamant on this point and said at once no, she had no education, so there was no question of transferring the company to her. Ben replied that he hadn't even considered that option, because she really had no education or experience. Because Taylor has been with him for more than 1 year, and he intends to secure a brilliant future for him. But Ben has announced his decision. He intends to gradually bring his daughter up to speed, and also, naturally, it will get a controlling stake in due course. And Taylor, who will own a solid chunk of it too, will always be there to help. I don't want to think about losing you, Daddy, Maggie exclaimed at one point. I mean, we've just found each other. That's how she called him father for the first time, and it happened when they were alone together. Ben nodded and smiled, tears welling up in his eyes. I don't want to think about it either, daughter. You're right, let's not talk about it. I'm not quite an old man yet. And Maggie refused to leave the village so abruptly. She said she needed time to think about everything, to think about what to do with Mama's house, to quit her job in peace. Ben reluctantly agreed. And Maggie and Vivian came back. Maggie was slowly going through her things, deciding what to take with her from the house. There was no need to sell it, and she decided she would just leave it closed. She wrote a letter of resignation of her own volition. And with no one, Maggie shared the story that had befallen her. So she was quite shocked when Nick approached her one day. It was late evening. The girl was returning from the meadow. She went to look at the sunset over the river. Hello, Nick said and walked beside her. Staggering, he was obviously not sober. So you went to town, he added. Maggie shrugged. They say you've got a real father. A rich one. Says who? Maggie stopped abruptly. She'd told Vivian not to say a word to anyone. Well, Nick stretched out and said, I've heard that story from the women. I understand, he added with a nasty grin. Your mother couldn't help herself then, in her time. She was weak, it turned out then. She decided to have an affair with a rich man. Well, it's clear, such women. Don't you dare. Maggie was choking with indignation. You don't know what you're saying. Shut up. Come on, Nick said. What are you getting so upset about? There's no offense to the truth. And you? Why aren't you in town with your dad? Let me guess, he suddenly moved closer to her. Money can't buy everything, can it? You can't compete with those city girls, can you? You've been teased by the rich for what you look like, haven't you? Well, don't be sad. Nick's hands insidiously dug into her thighs. You're ugly in the face, of course. But if you look at your face in the dark, you don't have to look at it. It's the other thing about a woman that counts. A scream was already rising in Maggie's throat, but then an unknown force tore Nick away from her, tore and threw him aside so that he fell right into the nettles. He screamed, of course, floundered, there was swearing. "Are you all right?" Taylor's voice came out. He was standing nearby, looming over Maggie like a protective rock, a guarding beast. "I'm here," Taylor said. "I thought I'd come see you." "Vivian said you liked to go to the river, so I didn't interrupt the atmosphere." He nodded at a distant car that Maggie hadn't noticed at first. "I thought I'd come up to you, just stand next to you." And then Taylor almost growled at the end. I saw him like that. And he clenched his fists and stepped toward Nick, with the clear intention of continuing the educational process. Maggie, aghast, rushed over and stood between us. "No, don't. I don't want you to do this." "Okay," Taylor exhaled and sent Nick a hard look. "Get out, and don't you dare go near her. Do you understand?" Nick, wailing about how it didn't hurt, and how someone in this city was crazy, hurried away. And Maggie, when the first shock had worn off, laughed unexpectedly for herself. And then Taylor took her hand and said that, since he'd somehow gotten to the very end of the sunset, maybe they should watch the stars go up. Maggie agreed she loved to look at the starry sky. "I've been thinking about you a lot," Taylor said. The girl withdrew her hand. Oh, what a strange tone he had. And then she froze like a frightened deer because Taylor had said he really liked her. "Impossible," Maggie breathed out. "No, it can't be." "Why?" he asked. "I realize that we don't know each other very well." "No, that's not what I mean." "Then what is it?" You see," Maggie replied with tears in her voice. I'm ugly." Taylor was silent for a moment. Then, he suddenly turned her toward him and put his palms down on her shoulders gently. "It's dark now and I can barely see your face, but I know it's beautiful. And when the sun comes up tomorrow, I can say it again without lying. I really think you're an amazing girl, and I really like you, I'm not kidding. It's different if you say no just because. Well, maybe you're not ready for a relationship, or maybe I'm not your type of man. Or you don't want to confuse personal and professional relationships after all. Ben said I'm supposed to help you get into the business and help you choose the best training so you'll be ready to take the business one day. In that case, I'll accept your choice, and the most I dare ask is to be your friend. But if you refuse me because of this, because of what's wrong with you, then I can't accept it. And I want to ask you out." Maggie had never before, since the stain had taken over her face, thought that love would be possible for her in this world. And even though Taylor had not yet said that very cherished word love, she could understand, she knew in her heart what he felt for her. But the trouble was that it was unexpectedly hard to accept it. But thanks to what he had told her, she was ready to do it. Maggie began, ready to answer with a timid assent. And she wanted to add that he might not think her a frivolous person for agreeing so quickly. But at that moment, a shriek pierced the silence over the river and meadow, and then a loud splash, and then the sound of frightened children's voices. Maggie rushed to the sound, and as she rounded the dense thicket of young trees, she finally realized what had happened. It turned out that it was 3 children of Ty they thought to go night fishing, settled on the highest place of the shore, but one, the smallest, fell off. "Damn it," exclaimed Taylor, who came after Maggie. "I can't swim." "I can swim." Maggie just kicked off her shoes and then jumped into the water. It was not so high to fly down, but the shore was not flat, but steep, going sharply into the depths. Muddy water muffled her, but Maggie didn't give up. A few strong strokes, she looked into the murky expanse of the river around. Got it. Tightly grasping the child's figure, she reached up to the air, to life. It took some more work to get to the part of the bank where they could get out. Taylor grabbed Maggie and the boy. Another of Taya's sons fussed nearby, and the daughter ran after her mother. Taya was shocked when the little girl came running and blurted out that Greg had drowned. However, while the mother, who was almost mad with horror, ran with her husband to the river, her daughter added that Maggie had jumped after Greg and would probably save him. And then Taya saw it all with her own eyes. "Thank you. Oh, thank you, honey. You saved my favorite son." Taya oohed and ahed, clutching Greg, who was roaring with fright and sniffling. Maggie stood nearby, wrapped in the jacket Taylor had thrown over her shoulders. She was silent. What was there to say? And Taya? Oh, in those moments, looking at Greg's savior, she suddenly realized with heart-stopping clarity how cruel and unfair she had been. And she felt so ashamed. So sick. "I'm sorry," Taya whispered. "Maggie, I swear on my children, never again. I'm sorry." "Oh, you're so kind. I've done you so much harm. I've poisoned you as much as the others. Oh, Maggie. I'm sorry. Ty's husband coughed awkwardly and joined his wife in apologizing. Maggie listened to the man. She was so tired. Frozen. Tired, really. Maggie left the village the next morning with Taylor. But before she did, she had a word with Vivian. And how unpleasantly surprised she was when Vivian confessed that, yes, she had shared a little of the news with a couple of acquaintances. "I'm sorry," she said. "But I'm not used to being a recluse like you." She asked me what we were doing when we went to town. Well, I told her a little. And what? I didn't really do anything wrong, did I? Maggie seemed to agree with her in part. And yet, she was very unhappy that the one she had considered her best friend for years had so openly shared the details of her private life with strangers. And time flew. Life in the city turned out to be unexpectedly interesting. But at first Maggie stayed at home. Ben and Taylor persuaded her to go out to the theater, park, restaurant, shopping. And little by little, though not immediately, but Maggie began to thaw. And it turned out that yes, there are of course people who look at her appearance. There are also those who can comment behind her back. But in principle, it is quite realistic to get away from it. And what was also pleasant, but in Ben's company, where he brought his daughter several times to get acquainted with everything to begin with, no one has not shown that her appearance is unpleasant. And Maggie understood here people, apparently, are afraid to offend the boss. But she was partly indifferent on their own, or forced, the main thing that did not offend. About 3 months later, it became known that Lexi had recovered. The stay in a good private clinic had done her good. She became more sociable, less withdrawn, and she wanted to go home to the relatives she had been staying with all these years. Ben had arranged it for her. But before Lexi stopped by Edie's house, they had a lot to talk about. Maggie, by the way, remembering how kind the old man had always been to her, one day when it was already fall, had approached Ben with a request: could she help Edie a little? His house had a leaky roof, and also the refrigerator was quite old. Ben did everything, and even more, he arranged for Edie to repair the building where he kept the animals, and also brought new appliances for the kitchen. Maggie did not forget about Vivian, with whom she finally made peace. She gave her best friend a bead of black pearls, which she had dreamed of since her youth, as well as a trip to an expensive sanatorium to treat her back. And then, one day, Maggie suddenly realized that she somehow began to not that forget, but let go of all the bad things that she happened to endure in the village from evil people. The girl gradually changed. At some point, she awoke a purely feminine curiosity about clothes, and she carefully, still a little shy, began to buy herself dresses, shoes, and everything else that could be imagined in the closet. Soon she chose a university to get an education on her father's advice. Maggie talked a lot with Taylor. They became closer and closer. And one day he proposed to her. And now Maggie, already without any doubts, was able to accept the fact that in life, just like in a good movie or novel, everything can be just fine, without obstacles and difficulties. She replied in agreement. "Only I have to do something before the wedding," she told Taylor. And he accepted her choice. The thing was that Maggie decided to try to get rid of the stain after all. Ben had chosen a clinic with the best specialists and reputation for her. Taylor accepted the choice of his beloved, but on the day on which the most complicated procedure was scheduled, worried. He waited for Maggie in the hall, comfortable, cozy, where in principle could wait for patients, their relatives and friends. Suddenly the doors opened, and Maggie entered with a quick step and threw herself on Taylor's neck. "What happened?" he asked. But the doctor said, "Did everything go through?" "No," Maggie said with a smile. "They canceled it." "But why?" And then she explained because she didn't need it anymore. Maggie suddenly realized that her spot on her face wasn't ugly at all, as others had convinced her. Yes, she wished it wasn't there at all. But it was impossible. And she didn't want to put herself at risk just to make it a little less noticeable. Maggie was finally able to just accept herself and move on with it, live with it. And Ben and Taylor, the two people closest to her, had been completely supportive of her in that.